Down in the depths of Facility 23, a group of scientists stand before a massive rumbling piece of machinery. They all hold their breath as the gigantic mechanism suddenly stops. It's eerily quiet for a moment before a door slides open. The scientists crane their necks to see inside, to see what the result of their great experiment was. These were some of the greatest minds in the SCP Foundation, but nothing could prepare them for what they had created. September 9, 2008 was an unseasonably frosty day when Dr. Charles Gears, one of the SCP Foundation's most iconic scientists, parked his Honda Civic outside of what seemed like an innocuous government cold storage warehouse. He sipped his coffee and surveyed the building, which he, along with about 100 others in total, knew to be Site-19, Facility 23. Why was Dr. Gears, former director of all Euclid-level containment at Site-19, here today? Because official testing was about to begin on SCP-914. The Foundation had acquired the machine now known as SCP-914 some time ago, but only after its recent reclassification to 914 had it been relocated to Facility 23. It must have been important because the entirety of the facility was being repurposed for SCP-914 research. They were dealing with an immensely complicated piece of anomalous technology here, and the same question was on everybody's lips. What exactly does this thing do? Dr. Arthur Hackett, the facility director, had requested the cold, clinical assistance of Dr. Gears in providing the answer. Once he'd finished his morning coffee, Dr. Gears headed inside. The facility's security chief, Agent Alan Sedna, had been beefing up security at the building, and at least 2 mobile task force units were already on call in case anything happened. The first day of official testing is always a crapshoot. You might get a nice drink out of it, like with SCP-294, or you may get an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. You never really know. All Dr. Gears knew, as he walked up the granite steps to the main entrance, was that he was already feeling exhausted. When you've dealt with anomalous objects and entities for decades on end, the sense of wonder and mystery begins to wear off, only to be replaced with a kind of tedium any office worker knows all too well. Everyone knew that Dr. Gears was devoted to the job, perhaps more than anyone else, but he approached the job with an emotionless effect. You wouldn't know from looking at him if he was thinking about the deadly anomalous creature in the next room, or what he was going to have for lunch that day. The doctor passed through security and was briefed in the break room by Dr. Lucius Veritas, director of research at Site-19. He explained that the machine seemed to work in the absence of any power source. Its mechanical structure is similar to machinery from the Industrial Revolution, but it's exceedingly complex for something constructed in that time. Foundation analyses into the structure of the 914 machine have shown it to have as many as 8 million moving parts, and that might even be an incomplete estimate. Dr. Gears wore his trademark blank face as he listened, solemnly nodded, and asked to be shown the anomaly. He was led into Containment Chamber 109B by a pair of guards. According to all current Foundation tests, the machine doesn't appear to pose any active risk of containment breach or danger to the guards, earning it the rare safe designation. As a result, aside from guards stationed on site, containment procedures for 914 were minimal. Whether this designation would need to be changed after testing was something Dr. Gears would soon find out. SCP-914 was a truly impressive sight to behold, a giant clockwork mechanism taking up around 18 square feet, with an unfathomably complex combination of screw drives, belts, pulleys, springs, and gears. A less stoic researcher might see the humor in recruiting a Dr. Gears to test such a device, but comedy definitely wasn't one of Dr. Gears' specialties. He stared at the machine with a detached fascination, analyzing its vital components at a glance. Gears noted a large mainspring beneath a rudimentary selection panel. The panel is copper, with a large selection knob fixed to an arrow above a series of different options: rough, coarse, 1-to-1, fine, and very fine. There was also a large key below the selection panel, for the purposes of winding up the mainspring and initiating whatever procedure this machine was designed to enact. Next, Dr. Gears noticed 2 large booths connected to the machine by a pair of equally large copper tubes. The booth on the left labeled Intake, and the right labeled Output. Incredibly, Dr. Gears was able to immediately deduce the purpose of this machine. It was designed to enact some kind of transformative process on whatever was placed into the intake booth. But what kind of transformative process? That's exactly what Dr. Gears was here to find out. The experiment was simple. They would gather a series of samples, both inanimate objects and living tissue, and use them to explore the different permutations of the 914 machine's transformative abilities. This initial series of experiments were approved by O5 Command and the site director, and with the 47 researchers present in Facility 23 at his disposal, Dr. Gears commenced his research into SCP-914. To minimize risk, Dr. Gears decided the first test would be a simple kilogram of steel. On his orders, the steel was placed into the intake booth. With the doctor's approval, a junior researcher set the control panel setting to rough and began twisting the mainspring key, at which point the booth's doors closed and a small bell inside chimed. The machine began to rumble, its 8 million working pieces churning into life. It continued like this for around 10 minutes before falling silent, at which point the output booth opened. What had once been a single lump of steel weighing 1 kilogram was now an uneven pile of smaller lumps, with evidence of laser cutting. Dr. Gears made note of the fact that having lasers within such a machine is both anachronistic and anomalous, and that the rough setting appears to messily cleave the object placed within the intake booth into pieces. Dr. Gears also noted that it would be unwise to test any kind of explosive material on the rough setting, unless of course they wanted to destroy the building. The research continued. Dr. Gears used another 1 kilogram lump of steel to test the 1-to-1 feature. This time the result was far more peculiar. The output booth contained the exact same weight in steel screws. This result was sparking even greater connections in Dr. Gears' impressive analytical mind. Firstly, the 1-to-1 feature caused the 914 machine to transform the output into something different from, but similar to, the intake. And while this would require further testing, it appeared that the 914 machine, despite being anomalous, does still follow the laws of physics. Samples passed through the machine conserve their mass and would not be transmuted on an atomic level from one element to another. Next, Dr. Gears pushed another lump of steel through the machine on the fine setting. The result this time was a kilogram of steel carpet tacks. From this, Dr. Gears was able to ascertain that the fine feature improves the samples placed within the intake booth somewhat. However, things got even stranger when Gears performed the same experiment on the very fine setting. The output booth provided several unknown gases and a lump of unknown metal with anomalous qualities. Namely, it was resistant to heat up to 50,000 degrees, impossible to bend or break with any force, and was a perfect conductor of electricity. Dr. Gears suddenly realized his task here may be more interesting than he'd initially imagined. Was that a bit of a smile on his face that one researcher spotted? Surely not. This was the famous unflappable Dr. Gears after all. The doctor decided to take it up a notch and began to test more complex items in the 914 machine. He removed his own wristwatch and placed it into the input booth before setting the machine to course and letting her rip. Literally, in this case. When the output booth was opened, the watch had been painstakingly disassembled into its component parts, with no damage to said parts. Dr. Gears noted the coarse feature as a more mild version of the rough, in the sense that it was able to take an object apart without any kind of fundamental damage. He also made note of the fact he'd need to get himself a new watch. Dr. Gears then asked one of the researchers to surrender their cell phone for testing. While none were excited at the prospect of their phone getting eviscerated by a clockwork behemoth, one of the researchers eventually surrendered their BlackBerry Curve to the doctor. He placed it into the intake booth on the 1-to-1 setting, and 10 minutes later, the output booth released a brand new Apple iPhone. Sadly for the researcher who donated his BlackBerry, he wasn't allowed to keep the new device. Naturally, Dr. Gears was interested in trying out the anomalous, very fine setting on a more complex object. Seeing as no other researchers were eager to hand over their personal effects, he took a Colt Python revolver from a member of security and ran that through the machine on very fine. The result was an extremely powerful energy weapon containing gamma radiation, which fired a beam capable of disintegrating anything in its path. While the weapon's power was immense, it was also too dangerous and unstable to be added to the Foundation's armory for general use. Having collected a wealth of data from more complex objects, Dr. Gears was eager to move to the next stage, live test subjects. While his fellow researchers had some reservations, the experiments pushed on, beginning with mice. A single white mouse was put into the intake booth on the 1-to-1 setting, and the machine was activated. The result 5 minutes later was an almost identical creature, save for the fact that it now had brown fur. Encouraged by the fact that the mouse survived the refinery process, Dr. Gears next applied for the use of 2 chimps in his SCP-914 experiments. The first chimp was run through the machine on the fine setting. The result was a chimp of human-level intelligence, who has since begun working for the Foundation under the alias Dr. Bobo, and the data from this test has been expunged from the official reports to protect Dr. Bobo's privacy. The second primate test, this time on Ruff, was not quite as positive. The chimp was dismembered, with the mutilated corpse showing evidence of cutting from high heat and crushing. Of course, everyone knew where these tests were eventually going. Dr. Gears requested 2 members of D-Class personnel for testing. The first was a 42-year-old Caucasian male weighing 108 kilograms and standing 185 centimeters tall. Dr. Gears ran him through SCP-914 on the 1-to-1 setting, resulting in a slightly taller Hispanic man with a slightly lower body weight. He immediately became severely confused and agitated, and attempted to attack the guards present, leading to his unfortunate termination by Foundation staff. It was on the final live test that tragedy truly struck. A 28-year-old Caucasian male was run through the machine on the highly anomalous Very Fine setting. The result was an utterly nightmarish creature. So horrifying that the majority of the details on its physical appearance have been expunged from the report. The creature made a sudden escape, breaching the relatively minor containment procedures intended for the inert SCP-914. This highly dangerous creature killed 8 guards, as well as 2 senior researchers upon emerging from the output booth. A special response team was dispatched to take the creature down, but that proved harder than expected. SCP-914 had massively improved upon the human original, especially when it came to its killing ability. Eventually, it was captured, but the special response team suffered injuries and memory loss as a result of the creature's anomalous powers. The creature was also severely wounded, and its blood caused corrosive damage to the plumbing in Facility 23. The creature expired from its injuries several hours later, turning into a cloud of blue ash that blinded a nearby research team. Dr. Gears would later comment that the experiments were ultimately still a success, in spite of some minor hiccups. Testing on the device continues to this day in an effort to understand the full potential of the machine. Though, for obvious reasons, biological testing on the machine has since been forbidden without direct authorization from O5 Command. After all, if an already dangerous SCP was ever subjected to the Very Fine transformation setting, we could be dealing with something beyond our greatest nightmares. Feeling hungry? Maybe you could go for a snack right about now, or a nice refreshing can of your favorite soda. Perhaps if you've got some change burning a hole in your pocket, a nearby vending machine would be a good choice. And trust us, there's no vending machine like this one. SCP-261 will give you a treat that's out of this world, or rather, out of this dimension. That's how this safe class anomaly earned its incredibly accurate name, the Interdimensional Vending Machine. It was first discovered in a dark alley in Yokohama, Japan. Japan is a place where you can find a number of strange and surprising things in vending machines, but nothing quite like this. The Foundation was first alerted to its presence after one of their web trawlers noticed some interesting chatter on Japanese online message boards about a magic vending machine. To these Japanese forum users, it sounded like a fanciful urban legend, a vending machine where you could get something truly fantastical if you have the yen to spare. But upon thorough investigation, field agents of the SCP Foundation discovered that the machine was no legend and brought it into containment. It's the kind of thing you wouldn't look twice at. An utterly generic black vending machine with no viewing window and a handwritten sign in Japanese that reads, "Out of order." But what the vending machine looks like isn't nearly as interesting as what it's capable of. When you insert your money into the machine, and it's important to note that it only accepts Japanese yen, the machine will dispense some kind of snack food or drink item. However, over time, the more the machine is used in a single day, the more bizarre the items it spits out will become. Foundation researchers have attempted to figure out how the machine works, but their task has been incredibly difficult so far. It doesn't appear to contain any snacks, and it doesn't seem to be made of any anomalous parts. Moreover, the machine simply won't work when the front panel is opened, or when any surveillance equipment is placed inside. In other words, it's pretty much impossible to look this gift horse in the mouth. Strangely, the machine is also capable of working without power, though when unpowered the vended products are likely to become stranger much faster. But let's be honest here, you're not here for Vending Machine Mechanics 101. You want to hear about all the weird stuff that SCP-261 dispenses, and frankly, we're with you on that one. Lucky for all of us, this is one of the anomalies that the Foundation has truly extensive test records on, providing us with a highlight reel of some of the strangest, wildest, and downright most interesting snacks and drinks straight out of another dimension. Bon appetit! Let's start off nice and easy with some of the snacks and drinks that are not only edible but also sound like they'd actually be pretty tasty. Like Pepsi Dragon Twist, a bottle of Pepsi soda with English packaging that tastes like dragon fruit. PepsiCo does not produce such a product, but honestly we wish they did. Same for Dark Side Cola, a clear liquid that becomes jet black shortly after being opened, which apparently tastes like your average can of Coke with a touch of spice thrown in. But hey, not everybody likes cola. Maybe you're a maverick, a rebel. Only a soft drink with a formal title can quench your thirst, and as such you prefer Dr. Pepper. In which case, maybe the vending machine will furnish you with an interdimensional Japanese product known as Dr. Pepper's Amusing Straw. This spatial anomaly wrapped inside a whimsical Dr. Pepper branded straw seems to contain far more liquid than should be able to fit in the straw. About 1 bottle's worth of soda, to be precise. A nice and convenient solution for whenever you need to get the fix that only an accredited doctor of popology can provide. And if you fancy something from the more intoxicating end of the beverage spectrum, for 600 yen you can get yourself a rare bottle of Billy Beer. It's just the thing for those who weren't alive during the Carter administration, but still want to try brew that was endorsed by the younger brother of President Jimmy Carter. This anomalous bottle of suds, which was bottled in the 1970s according to its label, came with a note reading, "I had this beer brewed just for me. I think it's the best I've ever tasted, and I've tasted a lot. I think you'd like it too. Billy Carter." Drinking the beer got a D-class intoxicated for 72 hours. But what if you've just wet your whistle and worked up a hunger in the process? Thankfully, SCP-261 has some delicious interdimensional food to satisfy your cravings. So for starters, how about a tube of the Little Bakery 7-grain? This small aluminum tube lets you squeeze out a blob of dough, which instantly rises and cooks itself into a tasty little loaf of bread. Testing has indicated that the bread is a little chewy, but still tastes completely fine. Not bad for a tubed baked good. How about some seafood to go with that bread? Then maybe for your entree, you can crack open a delicious pack of lemon clams. And we do mean crack very literally here. If you crack this bag of anomalous clams like a glow stick, they boil themselves. And once you open them, you're ready to enjoy a serving of tasty clams that have a slight lemon flavoring to them. Delicious. But if you're not that hungry and just feeling more like a snack than a full fancy dinner, the machine once put out the Lay's Bloomin' Onion. While it appears to be a normal onion, each layer of the onion is a different flavor of chip, leading all the way into the middle. Truly a gourmet snack with more layers than, well, actually exactly as many layers as an onion. And what about for those who are anomalously trapped in the year 2012 and are looking for a snack that is both tasty and meme-worthy? Well, you'd be lucky to receive a 700 yen bacon shirt. It's exactly what it says on the can, an edible shirt that both smells and tastes like bacon, and has no real side effects other than making you smell a little like bacon while you're wearing it. Though this could be a dangerous anomalous effect if you decide to walk through your local dog park while you're wearing it. We've been told it pairs well with the Meat Hat Teriyaki Fedora, a size 64 Trilby-style fedora made entirely out of teriyaki-flavored beef jerky. The object came flattened in a cardboard box bearing the tagline, "You can have your hat and eat it too," which is a pun that probably makes a lot more sense in their dimension. Still a bit hungry? Well, lucky for you, this magical vending machine has got you covered on dessert too. For 700 yen, the Foundation was given an entire edible chess set, with each of the ornate pieces carved from what seemed like hard Pez-style candy. It's less checkmate and more check-ate. Another pun that I promise is funnier in another dimension. And for 300 yen extra, you might walk away with a candy robot playset. These are more hard candy components that can be put together to create functional, anomalous mini robots that move on their own, walking aimlessly and bumping into walls. But what about the full meal-craving consumer on the go, who wants both a dinner and a dessert combined into one disgusting package? Don't worry, the interdimensional vending machine has got you covered. Just 400 yen can net you some delicious turdokochakan. These are balls of fried turkey filled with chocolate, a smaller ball of duck, more chocolate, and in the very center, a small ball of fried chicken. Even the labeling on the product describes it as having 450% of an adult human's daily recommended fat intake. We'll leave it to you to decide if this is a decadent treat worthy of the gods or utterly disgusting. Maybe you're feeling a little cheeky though, or you need the perfect comedic dessert for your bachelorette party. The vending machine has a candy direct from an alternate Korea, a tasty, if slightly too sweet, chocolate candy shaped like a certain male organ, filled with, we kid you not, liquid white chocolate. Perfect for anyone who has both the sweet tooth and the sense of humor of a 12-year-old. Okay, these were definitely all weird treats, but let's get really strange now. From the disgusting, to the confusing, to the inedible, to the straight-up deadly. If you're a bit of a sadist, perhaps you're the kind of person who enjoys watching their snacks dying in front of them before they eat them. For that, the vending machine provides an aluminum box with a viewing window and a red button on top. Inside are a collection of small furry creatures, each with a single big eye. When the button is pressed, the creatures inside are abruptly superheated, cooking them all to death. At that point, the box opens, and the creatures are ready to eat. We've been told they were crunchy, spicy, and tasted a little like beef. Maybe you're part of the slow food movement. For that, we recommend the delicious pile of slugs, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is a produce box, like the kind used for packing strawberries, except it's full of live slugs. There are both advantages and disadvantages to actually eating these slugs. The advantage is that they contain large amounts of vitamin C, E, and most of the B complex, which are all crucial to a healthy and balanced diet. The disadvantage is that they contain large amounts of arsenic, which will kill you. Though of course, if you still have a candy-flavored death wish, but you prefer your entomological treats a little more leggy, then may we interest you in a fine caramelized spider for a modest 500 yen. It's full of deadly quantities of an unknown anomalous venom that's pretty much impossible to cure, but it's worth it for the sweet, sticky goodness that comes before death sets in. Another strange item dispensed by the vending machine was a tall metal aluminum canister with a ring pull that, upon opening, had a violent chemical reaction with the air and triggered a large explosion. Apparently, this particular beverage was never intended for oxygenated environments. The blast killed 2 researchers and resulted in the temporary suspension of testing. Though in a slight silver lining for this fiasco, the testing area did smell of citrus for a few days, which the janitors must have enjoyed as they cleaned up all the body parts. Another dangerous snack provided by the vending machine was a long tube of chips called Prangles, not to be confused with any other long tube-based chips you may be thinking of. When the tube was opened, or popped as they say, the D-class that the chips were presented to began compulsively eating them. When researchers ordered the D-class to stop, it seemed almost as if they couldn't. Regardless of the orders given to them, the D-class just kept eating. Even when guards terminated the D-class there and then, the corpse continued to eat chips out of the tube until it was physically pried out of their hands. But if all those salty Prangles had really worked up a thirst in you, perhaps you can wash them down with a delicious can of Cherry Bomb, an intense cherry-flavored drink dispensed by SCP-261 for 450 yen. When a D-class sampled this delicious soda, they commented on it tasting strongly of cherry. A few moments later, their head exploded with the force of a stick of dynamite, coating everyone and everything around it in gooey head viscera. The resulting cleanup took an arduous 6 hours. But wow, was that cherry tasty. And finally, why not complete this anomalous vending machine feast with a 1,000 yen papier-mâché piñata, resembling a dead horse that comes ready to use with a baseball bat. Everyone who saw the piñata felt compelled to beat it mercilessly with the bat, until candy began to fall out. Many in attendance claimed that it was the 1000th gift unleashed by SCP-261, and thus warranted celebration. Once the dead horse was thoroughly beaten, all cognitohazardous properties ceased. There's a joke somewhere in there, but for the life of us, we're not sure we can find it. Oh well, maybe it's in another dimension. Someone was screaming inside the incinerator. The year was 1975. The location was a top-secret refinery and waste disposal plant, one of the many front organizations owned and operated by the SCP Foundation. This sprawling facility, separated into 3 different huge units, each with a specialized task, was located around 75 kilometers outside of Summer Springs, Colorado. It had operated for several decades without incident, but today all hell was about to break loose. Alarms were blaring in Unit C, the area of the facility that dealt with destroying non-anomalous waste via incineration. A traumatized worker had pulled the emergency lever near one of the incinerators in a panic when he'd first heard the loud banging against the interior walls, and then those horrific pained wails. That's when workers of Unit C came to a horrifying realization. The screams weren't just coming from one of the incinerators in Unit C. They were coming from all 6, a chorus of absolute agony echoing up out of the ash pits. This was impossible as far as the Unit C staff were concerned. These incinerators were only to be used for confirmed non-anomalous material. Could some animals or even some poor workers somehow fallen into the incinerators? But even if they had, what were the odds that someone had fallen in all 6 of them at once? It was impossible. The site director was immediately brought in to authorize an investigation, at which point he determined that at least one of the furnaces, in this case furnace number 4, be shut off so researchers and guards could investigate what was going on inside. It seemed like the obvious course of action, but for some of the people on site that day, this would prove to be a fatal mistake. When the fires were put out, something started rattling in the disposal chute. There was a scratching and squealing noise, like something scraping up against the metal. A maintenance worker was ordered to go check inside, and when he opened the hatch, he let out a bone-chilling shriek. There was something, or was it someone, climbing back up the disposal chute. It emerged from the darkness, backlit by the still-burning embers of the incinerator, letting out an awful screeching noise that could make even a hardened Mobile Task Force operative shake with fear. The creature was humanoid, a charred, mutilated skeleton reaching out towards the maintenance worker with a bony claw. Before the worker had a chance to stumble back in horror, the beast had clasped him by the throat and started to squeeze. It didn't even need to strangle him. The heat of its skeletal hand burned away the worker's throat in seconds, leaving his limp, wheezing body to drop to the metal grate of the platform below him. Several armed guards and maintenance workers moved forward to fend off the monster, but just then a volley of more violent shrieks echoed out of the chute behind it. It only took seconds for over a dozen more creatures to crawl out of the disposal chute. They were all like the first, people at various stages of incineration. Some were glowing, charred skeletons with barely any flesh, others looking more like severe burn victims, their faces contoured into scowls of hate and rage. The assembled guards opened fire on the sudden influx of anomalies, emptying the magazines of their submachine guns into their burning bodies, but their weapons didn't seem to cause any lasting damage. The bullets would tear through the flesh of the creatures, causing some of them to stumble and fall, but the wounds would close and the creatures would rise again. It seemed they possessed a deadly combo of extremely high aggression and incredible regenerative abilities. None of the staff present in Unit C were safe as the burning corpses attacked anyone they could find with their bare hands, beating and biting and clawing. Many of them would grapple with Foundation personnel, latching onto them and trying to pull them back down into the incinerator with them. These creatures, that would later be known as SCP-2419-A, caused several fatalities with their surprise attack that day, and the situation was only brought back under control when a mobile task force that possessed more advanced training and weaponry was dispatched to the location. Despite orders from the site director, The MTF found it impossible to actually terminate any of the entities due to their regenerative abilities. Instead, the MTF agents focused on forcing the anomalies back into the chute of Incinerator Number 4 using a powerful industrial steam lance. Once they were back inside, the incinerator's burners were started up once again. The MTFs were also able to capture 5 of the entities and detain them for questioning and experimentation, finally bringing this unexpected containment breach to an end. The Foundation is an organization that prides itself on possessing forbidden and secret knowledge, but even they had no idea what had just happened. There seemed to be no earthly explanation why these creatures would suddenly manifest inside the incinerators. But as the detained anomalies continued regenerating, a slightly clearer picture of what exactly the Foundation was dealing with began to emerge. Every single one of the captured anomalies kept regenerating, and upon getting to the point that they were no longer burn-scarred, the researchers studying the anomalous creatures discovered that each one was identical to a deceased D-class from the Foundation's records. They were physically and genetically identical to the dead Class D personnel, perfect copies, save for the fact that their sole mission in life seemed to now be pure and unmitigated aggression and violence. Researchers wanted to gain greater insight into the minds of these strange creatures through the use of extensive psychological evaluations and interviews. It would turn out to be a very dangerous investigation. A psychological researcher by the name of Dr. Warren conducted an interview with one of the SCP-914 instances in hopes of better understanding their mindset. This creature had been heard laughing not long before the interview began, so it wasn't an unreasonable assumption to believe that it could be capable of speech. The interviewee was separated from Dr. Warren by a thick pane of glass to prevent it from indulging in any of its more violent urges. The problem was that Dr. Warren and his assistant researchers had severely underestimated what these creatures were capable of doing to get what they wanted. Dr. Warren tried to begin the interview in good faith. He spoke calmly and politely to the creature through the glass, attempting to remind it of the person it once was. The anomaly didn't appear to be paying attention to the doctor, though, instead focusing on pulling its own arm apart and breaking the bones within. Dr. Warren began to think that the creatures weren't even sentient, if the only activity they seemed to engage in was the wanton destruction of themselves and others. But underestimating them like this proved to be a big mistake. By removing the skin off of its arm and whittling its bone down to sharp edges, the anomaly had transformed its arm into a makeshift knife. Before anyone realized this, it had already used its own jagged bones to break the glass divider and attack Dr. Warren. He perished not long after being stabbed multiple times in his face and eyes, and the anomaly was forcefully taken back to its holding cell. Dr. Daniel Jennings, a senior researcher, was then put on the case. He released a chilling memo of the creatures after his observation period ended. It read, "Before I came here, I worked as a prison shrink. Every person you met had a story bursting with pain and sorrow. Sometimes these stories were about the pain they suffered. Sometimes it was about the pain they inflicted. Some days you felt like everyone there was a beautiful soul torn down by their circumstances. Other days you'd find out what some of them did, and a part of you was glad that they were there to suffer for it. But at the end of every day, I always told myself, they're all humans. They're all people. They all deserve the same dignity, respect, and love as everyone else. No exceptions." Dr. Jennings goes on, "I opened up with that anecdote only so that you could understand that what I'm about to say is not said lightly. These things are not people. They are people-shaped monsters. They are well beyond any definition of psychopathy. Everything they do to hurt, maim, and kill. I would pity them, but that would imply that they're worth pitying. Put them in a hole, then fill that hole with concrete. Better still, throw them back into the incinerator where you found them. I doubt they'll even care." Following this string of unfortunate incidents, containment procedures were put into place to hopefully prevent anything that had happened to the unlucky Foundation staff from happening again. The entire facility was fenced off and was constantly patrolled by MTF Beta 7, also known as the Maz Hatters. a group specializing in containing anomalies which present powerful biological, chemical, or radiological dangers. The furnaces that the anomalous creatures emerge from remain lit at all times, with workers checking and carrying out maintenance on every single one each day of the week. Outside of this, the facility is essentially a no-go zone. Reinforced steel hatches cover the chutes, and they are to forever remain bolted shut. All because of that one terrifying day in 1975. That was the day that the Summer Springs Waste Disposal Facility, which had been a valuable asset to the Foundation for decades, instead became classified as the Euclid-class anomaly, SCP-914. It is not uncommon for a Foundation asset to one day become a dangerous anomaly requiring containment, but the same question always pops up after. Why? What had a place that had been so valuable to the Foundation suddenly become such an active danger? The answer, as is often the case, is contained within the question. Why would a waste disposal plant be so important to the Foundation in the first place? And more importantly, what else was going on at the plant to make it such an area of active importance for one of the most powerful organizations in the entire world? To put it simply, the plant allowed the Foundation to dispose of something far more important than mere waste material. It gave them what they needed to better erase memories. As you probably already know, the Foundation makes liberal use of amnestics on those exposed to anomalous material to make them forget what they had seen and experienced. But these elusive chemicals, many of which are sourced from SCP-3000, are an inexact science. However, at the Summer Springs Waste Disposal Plant, researchers discovered an immensely valuable alternative. Much of what was disposed of in the incinerators of Unit C were the bodies of dead D-Class personnel. Before being burned, autopsies were performed on the bodies to make sure they were non-anomalous, including the brain. Back in the 1960s, while performing research on the brains of dead D-Classes, they found a method of extracting and distilling the positive memories of the dead, creating a kind of happy soup. When administered into someone who has undergone amnestic treatment, this happy soup creates positive false memories in their mind that fills in those pesky blank spaces that are often behind. This was so useful that happy memories were extracted from the minds of every single D-Class corpse that passed through Unit C, totaling well into the thousands by the time that the first SCP-2419-A instances began to rise. But as all happiness, joy, and love were removed from the minds of the D-Classes, it seemed that all that was left was pure hate, pain, violence, and fury, feelings too intense and evil to destroy. These were bodies imbued with a malice so powerful that no fire could ever burn them away. They exist now with single-minded determination to get out and destroy everything around them, everything, including the ones that made them, the SCP Foundation itself. And in the end, it's only a matter of time until they get out. There are thousands of them in there, unable to die, unable to stop. The only thing keeping them in there is the constant burning of the furnaces around them, and those furnaces can't burn forever. The monsters lurking in SCP-2419 will outlive the fire that surrounds them. Because while the furnaces they are contained in are hot, the fires of hate that burn within SCP-2419 entities are even more powerful. And they know this. They know they can't be contained forever, and that someday soon, they'll be able to emerge and exact their terrible revenge. Those who must walk past the incinerators may think they hear their screams echoing out from within, but it's not screaming at all. It's laughter. As we all know, the SCP Foundation secures, contains, and protects the various anomalies under its custody. But their mission isn't limited to just grabbing the object and chucking it into a containment locker at the bottom of a classified site deep below the surface of the Earth. The Foundation wants to get a comprehensive, full understanding of all the strange items, creatures, and humanoids in its custody, because that's the only way to understand what they're capable of, what danger they pose, and how to effectively contain them. That much is logical. But the problem is that there's no global scientific community surrounding anomalies. at least not ones willing to cooperate with the Foundation. Perhaps the Chaos Insurgency or Global Occult Coalition have some scientists who have studied anomalies, or the various government agencies that know about the anomalous world like the Unusual Incidents Unit or Soviet GRUP. But for the most part, the Foundation is utterly alone when it comes to figuring out how these anomalies work, what they are, and how to combat them. So the Foundation does what any institution would do: experiments. Many of the Foundation's most important and iconic anomalies are defined by the experiments the white-coated scientists have performed on them, sometimes even using human subjects through the notorious and infamous D-Class program. Everyone knows about how SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy lizard, has been subjected to practically every known weapon and attack under the sun in an attempt to kill the highly dangerous, hateful predator. And who can forget SCP-914, the Clockworks, and the countless objects the Foundation has put through it on its 5 settings to see what it spits out. Needless to say, the Foundation's experiments are incredibly important to how the organization functions, so those SCPs that can offer lots of testing options are very treasured and prized, along with being iconic and legendary throughout the Foundation. Today we're going to be looking at one such anomaly, but not a dangerous, hostile, man-eating predator like SCP-682, or a mysterious eldritch machine like SCP-914. No, today we're going to be looking at something much more simpler than that: a coffee machine. Yes, today we're going to be inspecting SCP-294, affectionately referred to by guards and personnel as the coffee machine. Though you probably don't want to order a hot cup of joe in this coffee machine lest you, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The first thing you see when you open the SCP-294 file is its number, of course. Item 294, Object Class Euclid. The next thing you see is the image. If you were imagining a tiny little coffee maker before, this should get rid of that. SCP-294 is big, the kind of coffee machine you'd see in a factory break room. It's almost the size of a vending machine, and has a big colored window showing a few cups of coffee, along with the slots for cash and coins so drinkers can pay for their espressos. But the most notable feature on SCP-294 is the full keyboard on the front panel. It's a typical QWERTY keyboard, just like yours, with a spacebar and everything. Why on earth would a coffee machine need a keyboard? The special containment procedures paint an interesting picture, by which we mean there aren't any. SCP-294 doesn't need any special procedures, secret rituals, or complex machines to keep it contained. But it's still Euclid, so only personnel who have security clearance of level 2 or higher are allowed to interact with it at the moment. This is surprising when you realize that SCP-294 is currently being held not in an anomalous item locker or containment cell, but exactly where you'd expect to find a big coffee machine: a break room. Specifically the Site-19 second floor personnel break room. But it's not alone. It's monitored by 2 guards with level 3 clearance around the clock. For them, sitting in the break room all day guarding a coffee machine that can't move and is too heavy to lift has to be a pretty sweet gig, considering what other kinds of jobs are available at the Foundation. But all that raises even more mysteries. What the heck is up with this coffee machine? The description starts off obvious enough. Affirmed that yes, SCP-294 is indeed a standard coffee vending machine, but with the difference we all noticed earlier. Instead of a simple button list of options, it has a full keyboard on it, each button aligning with the letter on a real keyboard. And when someone slips 50 cents into the coin slot, quite a bargain for coffee if you ask me, the user gets a message on screen prompting them to enter the name of what liquid they'd like. You type it in on the keyboard, and that's that. The machine drops a little paper cup, and a nozzle shoots out 12 fluid ounces of whatever you requested. Pretty nifty, isn't it? But it gets niftier. Most people would only think to ask a coffee machine for, well, coffee. But SCP-294 accepts any liquid, and some things that aren't liquids. When the Foundation initially got their hands on it, they ran no less than 97 tests on it, after they realized they weren't just limited to espressos and cappuccinos. At first, any kind of liquid you could drink was requested. The researchers popped in requests for water, coffee, beer, soda, milkshakes, and out they came. Then they decided to get a little more creative. They started to request things you couldn't possibly drink, not if you wanted to stay alive. Sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, like the kind SCP-682 is suspended in. Wiper fluid, motor oil. But SCP-294 stubbornly provided, even if the liquids would melt through the researchers' throats like a knife through butter. Then the researchers decided to apply some of their scientific knowledge. There are a lot of chemical compounds that don't usually exist in a liquid state on planet Earth's surface. They typed in nitrogen, iron, and glass, among others, and received shimmering liquids in paper cups. They sent them off to a lab for analysis and, wouldn't you know it, chemically identical to nitrogen, iron, and glass. But when they typed in diamond, no doubt wondering whether they'd found an infinite cash cow, they received an error message on the screen. It seemed that while SCP-294 could deliver substances that aren't usually in a liquid state on Earth's surface, it needed to be at least possible for the substance to be in a pure liquid form for SCP-294 to dispense it. Since diamond is only a mineral, it couldn't be dispensed. Then they tried to test something else, and got a slightly disturbing response on the small LCD display. Out of stock. It stopped responding to requests for over an hour, then made a small noise and began to accept requests again. It appears that the machine can take about 50 requests before needing to take an hour and a half to restock itself. And while only the machine is anomalous, the small 12-ounce paper cups it dispenses its liquids in seems remarkably hardy. Substances that would have eaten through paper instantly, like the sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid, had no effect on these little cups, though the same can be said for those that drank from them. One of the researchers had a great idea. Here was an anomaly that was practically harmless, and could be a great little way for the Foundation to scale back its budget a little bit. They proposed putting SCP-294 into the break room it currently resides in, both to more easily conduct experiments and to save money when agents and doctors came in for lunch and needed a quick drink, or in the mornings where everyone was looking for coffee to wake them up. With no good reason not to, the machine was put in the break room, but not long after, an unfortunate incident occurred, one with enough harm that it was deemed necessary that only personnel with security clearance interact with SCP-294. What could have happened to cause this? Did someone burn themselves on hot coffee? Did the vending machine accidentally crush someone? No. The reality is much darker. One morning in August of 2005, Agent Joseph, whose full name has been redacted to preserve their identity, went up to the vending machine in the break room, looking to get a hot cup of coffee to wake himself up between shifts. Another agent in the room who was on break at the time saw him and made a suggestion to find out what SCP-294 would do when given the colloquial name rather than the exact real name of a drink. They just wanted to see what would happen. So Agent Joseph slipped in 2 quarters and typed in a hot cup of Joe. Seconds after, he began sweating like a pig. He was feeling very hot, even though the break room was fully air-conditioned, and his skin began to flush. He then clutched his head, complaining that he was dizzy, and the whole room was spinning around before collapsing to the floor. The other agent immediately called the medical staff, who moved Agent Joseph to the infirmary and stabilized him. Once they made sure he wasn't in any real trouble, they also grabbed whatever SCP-294 had spit out. It was a disgusting, thick, reddish-brown liquid with a strong stench, and when they ran the labs on it, they confirmed it was exactly what they thought it was: a mixture of blood, tissue, bone marrow, cerebrospinal fluid, and other bodily fluids that was an exact DNA match for Agent Joseph. SCP-294 somehow managed to literally liquefy 12 ounces from the agent's body before producing them into a cup. This offered a clue. Maybe it stole the liquids it was asked for from the nearest source. In any case, the agent was released after a few weeks of bed rest and care to make sure he wasn't further injured, and both involved agents were reprimanded. With the knowledge of how accidentally dangerous SCP-294 can be, who can blame the Foundation for wanting to keep a careful lid on it? Researchers were curious, though, and received clearance to test the SCP's abilities to retrieve specific liquids from long distances. With an O5's approval and oversight, they input a cup of SCP-075's secretion. SCP-075, the corrosive snail, is exactly what it sounds like: a gross little creature that secretes a highly caustic acid, capable of melting almost anything. Without fail, the coffee machine dispensed the secretion into the cup, and the cup stayed perfectly intact. But at the very same time, in SCP-075's cell, the creature woke up and began secreting acid that immediately disappeared. All in all, about 12 ounces, the same amount in the cup. Based off of these results, further testing with SCP-294 was approved. One researcher tried punching in a request for a cup of gold. What came out was a small paper cup of molten gold that quickly cooled to room temperature. Asking for cups of silver and platinum produced similar results, but based off of previous tests, it seemed clear that the machine wasn't creating precious metals, so much as siphoning them off from somewhere else. The next request was a strange one, a cup of anti-water. The machine took a moment, then printed a small message on its LCD display, out of range. This confirmed that the machine couldn't produce substances that didn't actually exist, and couldn't break physics to get its materials by peering into alternate universes, dimensions, or realities. After that, the researchers tested for diamond, and got the result that you already know of, an out-of-range error. Some more investigation showed that all solid substances that don't have a liquid form get this error, but asking for a cup of liquid carbon produced exactly that, because liquid carbon isn't the same thing as a diamond, though both are made of carbon. SCP-294 clearly has more knowledge of chemistry than some of us. Then the researchers created an entirely new drink, made of bleach, various sodas, protein powders, and spices. They blended it together and put it in a jar across the room from SCP-294. When requested, the amount of the liquid in the cup was missing from the jar, proving that SCP-294 doesn't actually create its own liquids. But how does SCP-294 react when presented with a more subjective request? One researcher asked for the best drink I've ever had. After a moment, the paper cup filled with something that looked like cola, but the researcher said it tasted like a drink he had years ago at a party, and that he'd always remembered as his favorite drink, though he couldn't say what was in it. But that was a subjective test, and the researchers repeated it with a different subject. When an agent also requested the best drink I've ever had, the machine produced a simple Vienna lager with a label showing a group of people drinking it at the beach and no brand name. The agent confirmed that the best drink he ever had was a Vienna lager at the beach with his friends. So SCP-294 could not only read people's minds, it can read memories they don't even know they still have. Another one they tried was something Cassie will like, referencing SCP-085, the young girl who lived in a drawn-on world. The cup dispensed was completely empty, but it had a small drawing printed on the side of a soda glass with brown and white things floating on top of each other. The researchers presented the cup to Cassie, and were told by her it was a chocolate banana milkshake, and a delicious one at that. A cup of music was a strange request, and produced an even stranger result. A clear, odorless carbonated drink that tasted vaguely alcoholic. When drunk, subjects said they could feel it, and started showing an affinity to music, being able to sing and dance to a rhythm when they had no sense of rhythm or were tone-deaf before. Whether SCP-294 can produce even more abstract concepts is still under study, but was interrupted by the next test. An unfortunate containment breach incident at Site-19 left several personnel trapped in the break room, heavily injured while MTFs fought to re-establish control over the site. An agent typed in a cup of medical knowledge, and the machine quickly produced a green liquid. After drinking it, the agent was able to treat the injuries of their fellow personnel consistent with standard first responder practices, and was commended for their bravery. But their knowledge didn't stick around after the breach, and attempts to recreate the liquid failed. They decided that SCP-294 broke its own rules for self-preservation in the emergency, implying that it's not only sentient, it is intelligent. A doctor using SCP-294 made a request close to him, my life story. While nowhere close to a drink, SCP-294 seemed to accept the input, until it started shaking violently and making odd noises. It remained in this new state for about 3 minutes, then returned to normal, spitting out a completely opaque black fluid, like tar, in a cup. Despite the strange reaction, the doctor drank the fluid, and immediately informed the others he was now able to remember everything that had ever happened to him, from the smallest childhood event to the most important events in his adult life. He excused himself and disappeared into his office. The next time the staff saw him 2 days later, he was carrying an autobiography 600 pages long. Then the researchers decided to try their luck and input "surprise me." The resulting solution was a cup containing what seemed to be regular water, right until a researcher touched it. It was just water, all right, but it had been superheated to 200 degrees Celsius while remaining in liquid form. The moment someone touched it, bang! It violently evaporated into steam, spraying boiling water everywhere. Not only does SCP-294 have intelligence, it has a sense of humor, albeit a quite rude one. The next 3 requests were for blood, namely blood of the Smilodon, or saber-toothed tiger, of the passenger pigeon, and of Founding Father Thomas Jefferson. But the only thing SCP-294 produced were out-of-range errors, confirming it can't take liquids that don't exist anymore. But in the next test, blood was received from wolves, saliva was received from horses, urine was received from koalas, and cerebral spinal fluid was received from Phoebromus pattersoni, a rodent that went extinct some 8 million years ago. Though if SCP-294 is working according to its own rules, it means that there may be still one in the wild somehow. For the next test, the researchers decided to get back to the scientific roots of it all. They made a request for a cup of D-151839's leukemia, knowing that the D-class in question had a very advanced case of cancer. The machine outputted it without any trouble, and analysis of the liquid showed it contained cancer cells that matched the D-class's DNA. But another request for the same spat out an out-of-range error. What's more, a medical checkup on the D-class revealed that their tumor was completely gone. But unfortunately, it was only a short-term fix. The cancer cells recurred within 2 weeks of the test. SCP-294 initially just seemed like a boring magic vending machine. But it was only after the extensive experimentation that you just saw a shortened log of that the SCP Foundation was able to discern its true nature. It wasn't an unthinking object. It was sentient, intelligent, and even a little sarcastic, though none of that stopped it from doing its job, providing people with a hot cup of whatever they needed to drink. Just make sure you type in your request very carefully. An SCP Foundation researcher is monitoring the salt content of a large tank filled with water. Inside the tank, just under the surface, is a huge mass of rusted metal. Though few pieces have a couple specks of their original shiny surface visible through the dark red exterior. The researcher suddenly looks up from his task though. Does anyone else hear that noise? It's a terrible noise, like metal scraping and scratching against each other. But the heap of metal in the tank isn't moving. Still, the noises continue though, and the researcher keeps staring at the unmoving hunk of metal in the tank. All he can think about is diving in and letting his body become a part of it. Kept submerged in a big saltwater tank at the SCP Foundation is an object, but perhaps a more accurate way to describe it would be as a machine. Referred to as SCP-882, the machine's containment tank is required, according to containment procedures, to be filled with at least 40% pure seawater, direct from the ocean. If at any point the rusty surface of SCP-882 begins to show signs of becoming more like shiny metal, then the percentage of seawater must be raised to 100% until the metal is completely covered in rust. Trying to keep metal rusted? That might sound like a strange concept, but you'll see why it's so necessary soon. SCP-882 looks like little more than a collection of seemingly random pieces of metal, all fused together as if they had been welded. Gears, cables, pulleys, screws, and belts, all different shapes and sizes, all made of different metals. All of these various components do not appear to be uniform or have been made to fit each other, and are instead all stuck together in one big, unstructured mass of metal objects. But SCP-882 wasn't built to be like this. Instead, this seems to be the result of one of SCP-882's latent anomalous properties, the absorption of metal. Any metal that comes into contact with SCP-882 will become permanently attached to it, and after a few days will be a new part of SCP-882. That means that any metal that touches that new piece will also become a part of SCP-882 and on and on. Because of this strange property, absolutely no metal is allowed to be brought near SCP-882, and only organic materials are permitted to come into direct contact with it. That includes using non-metal alternatives to keep the machine securely contained. SCP-882 is suspended in its saltwater tank by organic cotton fiber lines, which also require changing on a daily basis. Any and all researchers that the SCP Foundation has interacting with the metallic mass are required to wear thick cotton gloves at all times. You might think that this sounds pretty easy to contain. Just don't let it touch metal? No problem. Organic materials only. No removal of rust allowed? No sweat. The Foundation staff working with 882 probably felt the same way, until they started hearing SCP-882 make noise. While SCP-882 is usually silent, personnel that spend an extended period of time close to the machine have reported intense grinding or clicking noises coming from somewhere in the mess of metal components. While they start out low and are almost unnoticeable, these sounds get gradually louder until eventually they become completely unbearable for human beings to withstand. So then why don't these sounds show up on audio recordings? Because the grinding or clicking noises from SCP-882 are, in actually, extreme auditory hallucinations. But even though they aren't real, these sounds are more than capable of driving anyone who hears them into a state of psychosis. And here's where things get tricky. The only way to make the noises stop is to offer SCP-882 more metal. As mentioned, any object that is made of any type of metal that comes into contact with the machine becomes a part of its mass. Allowing new objects to become fused to the surface of SCP-882 will cause the grinding noises to subside, but will increase SCP-882's mass permanently. If the noises aren't stopped though, then the mental state of those afflicted by them only grows worse. And some victims of SCP-882's auditory hallucinations have gone so far as to throw themselves into the tank containing it, where they were killed almost immediately, their bodies crushed to death by anomalous forces and becoming unrecoverable from the tangle of gears and random metal objects. The SCP Foundation now requires any of its personnel that work directly with SCP-882 to report any instances of noise coming from the machine. Additionally, whoever reports hearing strange sounds in the vicinity of SCP-882 must turn themselves in for a full psychological evaluation. Depending on the results, the researcher will either be free to return to their work or will face containment themselves at an undisclosed Foundation facility. The surface of SCP-882 exhibits an extreme resistance to damage. According to the Foundation's testing, the metal structure has a tensile strength and toughness stronger than aircraft-grade titanium alloy. Despite this, the machine still seems to be constructed of weaker metals like tin, iron, gold, and many others still yet to be identified. It takes extreme heat and several hours of exposure at that to cut even the smallest portion of metal from the main bulk of SCP-882. But where did it come from? The SCP Foundation first recovered SCP-882 near an island commonly on the northeast coast of Banks Island, one of the larger islands in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Strangely, not a single scrap of metal, not even underground metallic ore, was found within a 1-mile radius of where the machine was discovered. Stranger still, the small town located nearby seemed to be abandoned, with signs that it had been devoid of any human life for quite a number of years. The collection of fused metal components, later designated SCP-882, was found submerged in seawater. The machine was coated in rust, and the Foundation has chosen to keep it in the same rusty state it has been kept in since its containment. Why? Because when Foundation personnel first attempted to remove SCP-882 from the water, and the rust began to flake away from SCP-882's metal surface, its gears and cogs started to turn. Foundation personnel on site were unsure of what the machine's purpose was, but wanted to halt it in case it proved deadly. A number of ill-fated attempts at containment occurred soon after, with any person getting too close to SCP-882 finding themselves pulled into its mass and crushed to death between turning cogs. After multiple accidents that resulted in the demise of Foundation personnel, Dr. Charles Gears authorized the use of SCP-2519 to help stop the movement of SCP-882's gears. SCP-2519 is an audio file titled Babylon MP3, which features the song By the Waters of Babylon by Philip Hayes and text from the biblical Psalm 137. Playing this file can cause malfunctions to occur in various electronic and mechanical devices, normally reducing the speed at which they can operate or causing a complete cessation of a machine's function. In SCP-882's case, the sound of Babylon MP3 successfully slowed the machine's moving parts, allowing Foundation personnel to safely get closer to it. Teams then cut the massive metal down to a more manageable size with extreme heat, and it was finally contained. However, another question arises. Surely if SCP-882 is a machine, then it must have a purpose, right? And perhaps more importantly, what is its connection to the infamous machine-loving group of interest, the Church of the Broken God? Both of these questions might just have one easy answer. To put it plain and simple, SCP-882 may just be the heart of the Broken God. The Church of the Broken God is a religious organization that the SCP Foundation has had a number of encounters with over the years. Members of the church share in the belief that life, specifically biological flesh-based life, is inherently wrong, even evil. This group worships mechanization, the process of making something or someone more mechanical in nature. According to the beliefs of the church, there were two gods, Yaldabaoth and Mechane, who created humanity together. Yaldabaoth was the god of flesh and animal instinct, granting humans their bodies, while Mechane, the god of machine and intellect, blessed man with the power of free thought. As humankind developed and its civilization began building machines, Yaldabaoth became enraged that they were ignoring the instincts she had bestowed upon them. She endeavored to destroy the creations of man, in an attempt to revert them to the animals she had intended to be. As legend goes, Mechane acted as humanity's savior and intervened to stop Yaldabaoth. The god of machine shattered himself, transforming his body into a number of pieces to form a cage for his fellow god. Fragments of Mechane rained down on planet Earth, fragments that the Church of the Broken God believes it is their duty to recover. However, a number of these pieces are cataloged as SCPs that the Foundation is either aware of or has in containment. They are SCP-882, or His Broken Heart to the Church, SCP-271, His Broken Gift, SCP-813, His Broken Eyes, SCP-1139, His Broken Tongue, SCP-635, His Broken Mind, and finally, His Broken Blood, which refers to SCP-217. Often using anomalous technology, members of the Church of the Broken God intend to uncover or steal these various components. The Church's ultimate goal is to bring the correct pieces together and completely restore Mechane's form. It is their hope that he will guide them to intellectual enlightenment and bless them with new mechanical forms so that they can discard their current flesh and blood bodies. However, the Foundation and the Church are certainly not the only groups to have a fascination with SCP-882. Near the Banks Island site where the machine was first discovered, Foundation personnel encountered a man, the sole survivor of the nearby town. This individual, by the name of Richard Wright, was apprehended and brought in for questioning with Dr. Gears. During their interview, Richard revealed a number of details about the townsfolk who had first uncovered SCP-882 and what ultimately became of them. According to his account, the community formed a cult around SCP-882 after a man named Alan found it. The machine's parts had begun to turn and move, but with no clear indication as to what was powering it. Soon, a local priest, Father Pat, also took an interest in SCP-882. Both he and Alan seemed to share the belief that the machine had been built by God for a higher purpose, and encouraged residents of the nearby town to come and offer metal to it. Richard explained that the locals were plagued by the auditory hallucinations typical of long-term exposure to SCP-882, kept awake at all hours of the night by clanking, grinding, and the screaming of metal. Before long, Richard noticed more and more metal items being fed to the machine, with many local residents content to just sit and stare at the mass. He also noticed that Father Pat and Alan both seemed to be acting strangely around the machine, insisting that all the metal that had been added to it still wasn't enough. Then one night, during a communion before SCP-882, Father Pat took a pair of pliers and began tearing out townspeople's metal fillings. Richard watched in horror as the priest wrenched teeth from the mouths of ordinary people and threw them into SCP-882, but still claiming it wasn't enough. Then he turned on Alan, accusing him of hiding metal from the great machine inside his body. The townsfolk turned on Alan, the first one to find SCP-882, and threw him and his metal hip into the machine, his body breaking under its moving parts. Luckily, SCP-882 remains contained, at least for now, until the members of the Church of the Broken God find a way to reunite the heart of their god with the other pieces of its scattered body, and Mechane can rise again, an outcome that his worshippers are eager to bring to fruition, sooner rather than later. Did you ever have to perform a dissection in school? Maybe you had to carve up a fetal pig, or slice into a frog while nightmarish visions of Kermit and a widowed Miss Piggy danced in your head. Though it's rarely a pleasant experience, unless your tastes are on the morbid side, most biology teachers would agree that the best way to learn how something works is to take it apart. As distasteful as it can be to hold a frog's tiny liver in your hands, it definitely does give you a better sense of the pieces that make up the complete creature. But what if there was an easier way to look at the individual parts of a living being? What if you could take it apart without ever having to prep a scalpel or stain your hands with the blood of innocent frogs? Like most of the seemingly impossible things in our world, the SCP Foundation discovered something that allows its users to do just that. In fact, it can handle a lot more than just a frog, and its applications go far beyond the confines of a high school science lab. SCP-291 is a small, plain steel building with a large door on one side. The door has no handle or knob and functions similarly to a garage door. The door cannot be pried open by any ordinary means, and the inside of SCP-291 can only be accessed if the structure is connected to a suitable power source. Once a power source has been connected, the door raises and exposes a room inside. It is small, about 4 by 2 meters. It contains a console board, a large screen, and a plexiglass container resembling a coffin. How very sinister. The coffin is large enough to contain a human under 7 feet tall. So sorry, Fernand the Cannibal, you're going to need to sit this one out. The coffin sits on a conveyor belt with several tubes connected to the wall above it. On the opposite side of the room, there are holes of varying sizes, each containing a small door that can be opened or closed. Because initial observation indicated that SCP-291 was intended for some kind of human testing, a D-class test subject was selected for experimentation. The subject was instructed to lie down in the coffin and wait to see what would happen next. The display screen lit up, depicting a grid-lined image of the test subject. Buttons along the console board adjusted the image, showing the skin, muscles, and organ systems of the person in the coffin. There were no words or numbers on the screen, and all of the buttons appeared to have only 2 settings: on and off. When one of the researchers pressed the first button on the console, the tubes above the coffin began pouring a blue liquid into it. The test subject reacted with confusion, but did not experience any adverse effects. They quickly lost consciousness, indicating that the liquid was some sort of sedative. The liquid continued to pour into the coffin until the vessel was completely filled, at which point it congealed into a thick gel. The test subject's breathing and heartbeat slowed to a stop, and the conveyor belt suddenly creaked to life. The coffin was carried, test subject inside, through a small door that immediately locked behind it. The small room was filled with the sounds of gears turning, machinery clinking, and motors whirring. The display screen was taken over by a large rectangle, resembling a traditional loading screen. After 30 minutes, the process was complete, and the back door of the room unlocked itself. When the researcher walked through the back door, they found another room with a conveyor belt and a row of 24 lockers. Each locker was opened, one at a time, and its contents removed for examination. Inside each, the research team found a different portion of the test subject's body, in a block of some unidentified clear substance. The body was divided in the lockers into these separate parts: brain, lungs and diaphragm, heart, digestive system, reproductive organs, left eye, right eye, upper left torso and arm, upper right torso and arm, lower left torso and upper leg, lower right torso and upper leg, lower left leg and foot, lower right leg and foot, lower left arm and hand, lower right arm and hand, neck and head, upper skeletal system, lower skeletal system, lymphatic and circulatory system, and skin. Whew, a miracle of the human body, right? Boundless in its fascinating complexities. Each block of body parts was placed back in its designated locker, and the second button on the console was pressed. At this point, the doors to the organ lockers sealed themselves shut, and the sound of the machinery working filled the small space once again. This continued for a duration of approximately 45 minutes. When the machinery went silent, a new plexiglass coffin emerged into the main room, with the test subject inside. He looked identical to how he had looked at the start of the experiment, with no evidence that he had previously been disassembled. The blue liquid slowly evaporated from the container, and the test subject opened his eyes. The lead researcher conducted an immediate interview with the reassembled subject, who reported no memory of the process after initial exposure to the blue liquid. They insisted that the process had been like a good night's sleep, which honestly makes us pretty eager to take it for a spin. A medical examination determined that there were only a few changes to the test subject during the disassembly and reassembly. When they returned to consciousness, the test subject's stomach was empty, they were naked, and all of their hair was gone. With this new understanding of SCP-291's anomalous properties, the Foundation decided to continue their experimentation. With each new test, the experiments became more creative and, unsurprisingly, more depraved. First, a D-class subject was placed in the coffin and disassembled. Then, instead of placing the various body parts in their designated lockers, the vital organs were removed from their storage before reassembly was attempted. This resulted in the equipment shutting down completely. A researcher pressed the third button, which forced a hard reset of the entire process, causing all of the blocks of body parts to eject via an exit hatch. During the next experiment, non-vital organs were removed before the subject's body was reassembled. The appendix and gallbladder were left out, and when the subject regained consciousness, these organs were still gone. However, there was no visible damage or scar tissue in their place. They were simply gone, as if they have never been there in the first place. So, if body parts could be removed from a test subject, could new body parts be added? Could existing body parts be replaced with different ones? A D-class subject in need of a skin graft following a flamethrower-based accident was placed in SCP-291. Once taken apart, a portion of healthy skin donated by another, somewhat unwilling D-class subject was placed in the locker, along with the skin already present there. Once the subject was put back together, the healthy skin had replaced the damaged skin with no adverse effects. Repeat attempts at this test showed that it was effective for limb transplants, heart transplants, and kidney transplants with a 0% failure rate across all tests. After determining that SCP-291 could be used for an untold amount of good, making organ donations easier and safer than ever, the Foundation naturally had to pivot to something more useless, but interesting and likely horrifying. After all, it's not like they could ever just make anomalous technology available to the public, right? 2 D-class subjects, 1 man and 1 woman, were disassembled by SCP-291. The brains of the test subjects were swapped, and then they were reassembled. When they awoke, the subjects had the personalities and memories of the brain placed in their body. In a turn of events previously only seen in blockbuster comedies like Freaky Friday and the live-action Scooby-Doo movie, seminal piece of cinema, the subjects had swapped bodies. They were subsequently disassembled, their request to look at their new bodies naked having been swiftly denied, and the brains were returned to their rightful bodies. After the experiment was finished, the subjects appeared mostly normal. However, they did complain of disorientation as well as mental and physical discomfort over the next several days. After going through 2 brain transplants in 1 day, though, that's really the least you can expect. After perfecting the practice of swapping body parts between different human subjects, the ghoulishly curious research team decided to take things in an interspecies direction. A variety of test subjects, including cats, dogs, lizards, fish, mice, and, of course, humans, were selected for this next round of experiments. 20 tests were performed using these new subjects, and only 3 of the experiments were successful in transferring body parts from an animal of one species to another animal of a different one. Attempts to swap body parts between mammals and reptiles or fish proved disastrous. When a fish and a human were both disassembled and the fish's gills were placed with the human's body parts, neither creature survived the reassembly process. The human awoke with a new set of gills embedded in their neck and immediately began gasping for the oxygen they could not take in. Within minutes, they had suffocated. The fish's fate was even worse. It did not reassemble so much as it became a pile of goo, scales, and 2 floating eyeballs. Experimentation with a human and a lizard yielded similar results, turning the lizard into a puddle of organic matter and killing the human test subject after only a few minutes. As disastrous as the failed cross-species tests were, the successful ones were almost as bad. Trial 001 involved a cat and a human. Not wanting to attempt too much at once, the research team opted to just swap out one organ, the left eye. Both subjects survived the transfer and were able to use their new eye. The human subject reported full use of the cat's eye, with improved night vision in addition to trouble seeing color. The cat did not enjoy its new eye nearly as much as the human subject, and had clawed its human eye out of its head by the end of the following week. In Trial 007, a successful brain transfer was performed between an adult human man and an English Mastiff. The man in the Mastiff's body expressed discomfort with walking on all fours and asked to be returned to his body as soon as possible. The Mastiff in the man's body adjusted to bipedal locomotion in a few hours, but was disassembled after urinating on a researcher's shoes. The final successful trial, and the most unnerving, was Trial 016. A female D-class test subject's reproductive organs were swapped with those of a pregnant Labrador retriever. An ultrasound conducted after the transfer indicated that the Labrador fetuses survived the procedure and could conceivably be carried to term by the human subject. Several members of the research team began to take bets on whether or not she would end up giving birth to puppies, but the transfer was reversed within the day, so we'll never know what exactly would have happened. Perhaps that's for the best. Personally, we hope the Foundation's Ethics Committee gives some of these scientists a very stern talking to about their behavior on this one. When not in use for testing, SCP-291 is to be disconnected from any power sources. At least 2 personnel are positioned outside of its containment at all times, standing guard, and these personnel must be swapped out every week. When it is not connected to any power sources, SCP-291 is considered harmless, though it should still be treated with caution. The main entryway remains closed and locked when there is no available power source, but the door can be opened manually from the inside in the event of an emergency. Any disassembled organisms are stored in a locker in the containment facility, labeled with a Sharpie marker in order to keep track of what specimens are stored there. Whether this is the same Sharpie used to label food in the break room fridge is unknown, but just like Dr. DiRamiro's ham sandwich, it's best to leave these items untouched. Any personnel found to be responsible for missing specimens will be transferred to another project and receive a strongly worded email. Who among us hasn't wondered what happens after our lives have come to their inevitable ending, and we play out our final moments in the land of the living? The concept of what happens to us after we've died has baffled scientists and philosophers the world over for almost as long as human civilization has existed. Some out there already claim to know the exact answer. You probably already know that the belief in the existence of an afterlife is one held by almost every single religion and culture around the globe. Heaven, hell, Valhalla, purgatory, limbo, Sheol, the world to come. Descriptions of the afterlife and how to get sent there often varies depending on the religion or cultural group it is linked to. But to think in more general terms, the concept usually revolves around the soul leaving the body after death and living forever in eternal paradise. That is, of course, unless you've committed any deadly sins during your lifetime. If the myths are to be believed, these normally result in you being sent down to spend eternity in damnation and endless punishment instead of paradise. Sadly, there's no way to prove if any of the various afterlives actually exist. By their very nature, these afterlives exist separate from the real physical world that we live in while we are still alive. While we're here on Earth, we can only observe what we see happening to a body after death, and what we assume or believe the afterlife might be like. After all, it's not like any deceased person can tell us what being dead is like. Well, not under the normal circumstances anyway. With no proof of the afterlife's existence, we do unfortunately get left with the bleak and existentially terrifying assumption that when we die, there is nothing waiting for us on the other side. What if there is no light at the end of the tunnel? No pearly gates? Just nothing forever? But what if someone or some mysterious group of persons already knew the answer to what happened after the end of all human life? And what if the answer was so much more horrifying than we ever could have imagined? So much so that this shadowy cabal had already tried to prevent the fate awaiting all of us after we die. Be warned, we're about to delve into the unsettling tale of something known as Project Dammerung and its connection to something known as SCP-3448, as the Foundation categorizes it. It is a story about our fear of what comes next, beyond this mortal coil. This is the catalyst for the Foundation uncovering the most horrific secret in human history, a truth that should have stayed buried. Warning, we are about to unravel the beginning of the end. The end of what, you might be asking? Why, the end of death itself, of course. Any outsider looking in might think we're being a little bit overdramatic here, but we'll forgive you for that mistake. You can have that one on us. At first glance to the untrained eye and uninformed individual, SCP-3448 might just seem like little more than a magnetic resonance imaging machine. Chances are you've seen these big machines in medical dramas, or maybe you've even been placed inside one during a stay at the hospital. Using powerful magnets, an MRI machine aligns all the protons in your body. Then the machine generates a pulse of radio frequency current to create a detailed image of the inside of a patient's body. Basically, to put it in extremely oversimplified terms, it's a big camera for looking at your internal organs. Now, don't forget to smile, really show off that pancreas. It looks great at this angle. Of course, when dealing with anomalies encountered by the SCP Foundation, few things are ever really exactly as they first seem. And in that very same vein, SCP-3448 is far more than just a harmless piece of medical apparatus. Look beyond the main bulk of the MRI machine, and you'll start to notice that a few unique modifications have been made to the device. For one, the winding mass of jumper cables connecting the machine to its rudimentary upgrades, namely the same type of technology used in particle accelerators, along with a whole collection of custom circuit boards. For another, although you wouldn't know just from looking at SCP-3448, the contraption has also been through a number of anomalous rituals, seemingly combining the technological with the occult and spiritual. But the question remains, why? What is this thing for exactly? To put it simply, it's a hotline to the great beyond. SCP-3448 is a means of communication with the world of the dead themselves. Now, we might be oversimplifying things yet again there, so let's take it from the top. Project Dammerung was the name given to those who developed SCP-3448. That designation doesn't just refer to the modified MRI machine itself, but also the communication that said device was capable of after the Project Dammerung team had finished their tinkering with it. You see, nobody knows what happens to us after we die, because no one has ever been able to experience being dead in the real world and existing in the afterlife at the same time. But with SCP-3448, that problem just simply isn't an issue anymore. Still with us so far? Okay, here's how the machine actually works. A living human is placed inside, just like those ordinary MRI machines at your local hospital. However, the difference here is that the extra anomalous components of SCP-3448, the rituals, the particle acceleration, and so on, allow this person to enter a unique state of being halfway between life and death. Their bodily functions are halted, brought to a stop by the machine. However, they are still able to retain their consciousness and the awareness that this allows for. Not quite dead, but not quite alive either. Sort of an unalive state, or a half-death, if you prefer, or perhaps afterlife. Now, while a person is in this half-death, they will have entered a conceptual state of being. This is referred to as SCP-3448-A, an existence of pure consciousness while physical form, in this case the person's body, exists separately in the real world. The body, now called SCP-3448-1, no longer houses a subject's consciousness, their essence, not just their mind, but their thoughts and personality. If it helps to think of it in theological terms, you could even think of it as their soul. But while the machine's function is all very impressive and interesting, what's the actual point to it? Why spend so much time trying to create a controlled separation of consciousness from a dead body? What's Project Dammerung for? Well, that's easy. SCP-3448 is the primary tool intended to complete the sole objective of Project Dammerung, a mission to capture a dangerous cognito-hazard, namely, death itself. To be clear, when we say death, we don't mean the Grim Reaper, that skull-faced, scythe-wielding embodiment of oblivion. Chances are you can probably catch him just by going out on Halloween with a big net. But Project Dammerung's goal was to contain the actual process of death, the very concept that takes a living, conscious entity and makes it the opposite. You see, when a living subject is placed in SCP-3448 and their consciousness leaves their brain, it leaves behind some kind of anomalous electrical energy signature. As you may already know if you can remember back to high school biology class, the brain uses electrical impulses to send signals all over the body, allowing your organs to function, your limbs to move, and your muscles to contract or relax. What's strange is, this electrical activity seems to continue within the brain of someone whose consciousness has been separated from their body by SCP-3448. Studying these signals, the SCP Foundation personnel working on Project Dammerung have inferred that these are residual signals, replicating how the brain would react if the subject introduced into the half-dead SCP-3448-1 state as if they were still alive, even though they have to be dead in order to access that state in the first place. And now your brain is probably such a mess of electrical signals trying to keep up with all of that you might have actually completely missed the part where we told you that Project Dammerung is actually a Foundation-backed project. Okay, let's have a speedy recap. So far, we have an anomalously modified MRI machine capable of splitting the consciousness, or soul, of a person after rendering them clinically dead. On top of that, the Foundation themselves sanctioned the project that created this device in an effort to capture and contain death itself. But how did this come about? Who among the SCP Foundation would want to contain death so much to commission an entire project dedicated to that goal? Well, who do we all know sitting above the entire Foundation, overseeing everything, infamous for all having some anomalous form of immortality, and would stand to gain from Project Dammerung? That's right, the World Championship Death Dodgers, the O5 Council. You see, in order to more fully understand why Project Dammerung was established and why they built SCP-3448, we need to explain a little bit about a different anomaly, SCP-2718. We have another video on this channel that goes into more detail about that, but to put it in a nutshell, SCP-2718 is the horrible truth about what happens to us after we die. The O5 Council first learned of it when one of their own, O5-11, full name Roger Sheldon, died of a stroke. O5-11 was the only council member to have refused to accept any of the anomalous treatments or enhancements that prevented the other O5s from dying. However, the council chose to resurrect him. Upon his return to the land of the living, Roger Sheldon told the other overseers what he had learned about the nature of the afterlife, what lies beyond this fleeting mortal coil, waiting for us after we die. Roger had experienced firsthand that the dead actually remain conscious after their bodies have shut down all other functions. That meant that everyone, every person to have died over the course of human history, has remained aware of everything that happened to them afterward. They can feel themselves slowly decaying, their bones and skin withering, buried under the cold, wasting away into nothingness day after day. And that's SCP-2718, the painful truth that there is no paradise, no heaven, no afterlife. There is just endless, silent consciousness beyond the end of every life. This revelation is what instigated the Overseer Council, specifically O5-4, to establish Project Dammerung. It was learning the answer to what happens next that spurred the creation of SCP-3448. The intention was, by reading and interacting with those residual electrical signals in the brain, that the Foundation could create a link, a form of two-way communication between them and the living world and the subject, SCP-3448-A, in their half-dead state. Using other items and anomalous technology connected to the MRI machine, the Foundation's researchers could interpret the electrical signals in SCP-3448-A's brain as images. A Foundation agent by the name of Anthony Michaels proved to be the only test subject capable of using SCP-3448, beyond the earliest tests on animal specimens. And we know what you're thinking. The Foundation would normally use D-Class personnel for this sort of test. After all, it's a machine that renders you almost dead, stopping all bodily function. The problem was Project Dammerung needed someone loyal to the Foundation, and D-Classes could hardly be trusted to follow orders without the threat of death. Think about it. You separate their consciousness from their body, and they don't care if you threaten to kill them. Agent Michaels served as the SCP-3448-A component, residing within the modified MRI machine, held in a state between life and death. But something went wrong. Something that would ultimately do more harm than good. The Foundation had tried in vain to contain death, and in tampering with forces well beyond their own understanding, may have accidentally done something even worse. They neutralized it. They killed death. And things only went downhill from there. Dr. Lola Bergman was an accomplished senior researcher for the SCP Foundation. Her years of hard work studying anomalies and dedication to the Foundation had earned her a Level 3 security clearance, allowing her to access a bevy of secret information across the Foundation's vast network. As a researcher and a scientist, Dr. Bergman was the naturally inquisitive type. She wanted to know everything there was to know about the strange and esoteric universe around her. That's why, when she heard about the file for SCP-2000, one of the organization's best-kept secrets, she was hooked. The only problem was that just to view the file, you had to be on the O5 Council or have a special subset of Level 4 clearance known as 4-2000. Unfortunately, Dr. Bergman was only a Level 3, but you know what they say. The forbidden fruit always tastes the sweetest. Dr. Bergman had given the Foundation years of service. What could the harm be in breaking the rules and getting a peek behind the curtain just this once? Through somewhat deceptive means, Dr. Bergman managed to get her hands on some 4-2000 clearance credentials and decided to access the file on an encrypted personal device. They'd never even know. But as she entered the credentials, she found herself suddenly looking at an image. On its face, nothing. An image of a dirt road in a field with tiny white text reading, "Remember us." But this was a powerful cognito-hazardous image capable of causing immediate incapacitation. The next thing she knew, she was laying on the ground, unconscious. When she woke up, she was no longer a doctor at the SCP Foundation. She was on a street corner, unable to remember her own name, let alone her history. All she could do was murmur something about a secret under Yellowstone National Park. Dr. Bergman's years of service had meant nothing in the end. SCP-2000 is an anomalous asset so vital to not only the Foundation, but the entire world, that so much as attempting to access it without the proper clearance leads to immediate termination. But what's really hidden under Yellowstone National Park? And why are the Foundation higher-ups so intent on keeping it secret, even from most of their own ranks? Of course, Yellowstone National Park itself is no stranger to anomalous activity. The entire national park is technically an SCP known as SCP-1422. While it since has been neutralized, SCP-1422 caused all members of the SCP Foundation to have no awareness of Yellowstone National Park prior to 2007. But the true nature of SCP-2000, the secret hidden under Yellowstone National Park, is not only stranger than SCP-1422, but also, depending on your perspective, either profoundly relieving or utterly terrifying. But before you can truly understand the purpose and gravity of SCP-2000, or the Deus Ex Machina, we need to talk about the end of the world. In Foundation parlance, K-Class scenarios are events which have drastic implications on the state of society, normality, or even life. The most dangerous and feared of all of these are XK-Class scenarios, which are, for all intents and purposes, the apocalypse. There are a worrying number of anomalies capable of bringing about an XK-Class scenario if the Foundation ever dropped the ball on their protection or containment. While the Foundation believes that prevention is always preferable to the cure, what happens when prevention doesn't work? What happens when our worst fears are realized, and the end truly comes for us all? The answer is, SCP-2000 happens. Simply put, the anomaly is a reset button. a chance to start over when all life has been compromised by anomalous activity. 2000 is a giant and mysterious facility beneath Yellowstone National Park. The entrance is disguised as a disused park ranger station, feeding into a facility that burrows miles down into the earth. It's a place that contains incredible anomalous technologies capable of bringing the world back to its former glory, even after the worst happens. Only a select few personnel are allowed to work at the facility, keeping its machinery maintained in case the day comes where we ever need to use it again. These personnel are not allowed to come and go as they please, and their memories of 2000 are wiped if they're ever reassigned to different Foundation duties elsewhere. Why all the secrecy? SCP-2000 is the Foundation's and humanity's lifeboat, and as such, the base is well guarded both from potential human threats as well as anomalous activity and reality warpers. The surface-level entrance to the base is surrounded by a number of strategically placed Scranton Reality Anchors, or SRAs. These devices, largely constructed of corrosion-resistant beryllium-bronze alloy, keep certain type of reality-bending anomalies from manifesting their powers within the vicinity of the base. However, these are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the state-of-the-art Foundation technology employed within and around SCP-2000. You probably have a lot of questions, and that's understandable. What kind of technology can possibly reverse an apocalypse? And what did we mean when we said we may need to use it again? Well, listen up, because this is going to be a lot to take in. SCP-2000 is powered by a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, stabilized by 5 Xiank Anastasicos constant temporal sinks, and hosts to the most miraculous technology of all: 500,000 bright Zartion hominoid replicators. Utilizing geothermal energy from the volcanic activity in the area, the base could potentially remain operational forever if Foundation staff kept up with maintenance. The grand majority of the space in this huge subterranean facility is taken up by building materials, construction equipment, factory machinery, agricultural equipment, and computer database storage. Why? Well, let's explain the process of the apocalypse and how it relates to the activities of SCP-2000. In any K-class or end-of-the-world scenario that doesn't destroy SCP-2000 in the process, any surviving Foundation member can enact Procedure CYA-009, while any Foundation facilities globally can monitor the unfolding situation. While SCP-2000 is waiting for the all-clear to do its thing, remaining Foundation sites set in motion what is known as the Ganymede Protocol. This involves collecting and preserving materials which could be useful during the recreation process. However, it's extremely possible that in a sudden XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, there may be no surviving Foundation personnel, or at least, not enough to maintain any kind of organization. Thankfully, there are fail-safe measures for such a scenario. During the periods of extended inaction caused by an apocalypse that destroys most human life, SCP-2000 will gradually, autonomously, relax its security measures. Any personnel, regardless of clearance, will be able to activate the next stage of the process when this occurs. If such a thing doesn't happen for an extended period, the security measures lapse further, to the point that even the presence of an animal could activate it. This would set into motion Procedure Lazarus-01, humanity's last hope for survival. That's where the 500,000 bright Zartion hominoid replicators, or BZHRs, come in. These incredible pieces of anomalous technology are capable of perfectly cloning the entire human race from any given period in the last 20 years, even down to their ages and memories, thanks to Class G hallucinogens and developmental hypnotherapy. With a warm-up period of 5 days, these machines are capable of creating 100,000 viable, non-anomalous humans per day. The facility keeps records of all known human alleles, and is capable of recreating any lost human genomes or generating as many new and unique genomes as necessary to repopulate human civilization. Which humans the machines generate depends on the period of time the machine is ordered to replicate. It will first reproduce prominent cultural and political figures, as well as the acting top brass of the SCP Foundation to coordinate the recreation effort, of course. The machine will then recreate, well, everyone else. You're probably wondering, if the world outside SCP-2000 has been destroyed, then what good is creating all these new humans if they have nothing to go back to? Thankfully, SCP-2000 has a contingency for rebuilding both the infrastructure of civilization as well as society itself. The first-generation clones will have one mission: rebuild, and they will have quite literally all the resources in the world to do it. In addition to having all the physical equipment for buildings and agriculture, SCP-2000 stores an immense amount of data, which is appropriate, considering the whole facility is basically a huge backup drive for life itself. They have the entire internet backed up, as well as the sum of all human memory, and a wide cultural base with copies of thousands of famous works of art, music, and literature. They have all the scattered jigsaw pieces of the time that came before, and it's their job to put the whole thing back together. It's expected that many of the first generation of clones will die in this process, but that's fine. With the BZHRs working at full capacity, anyone can be replicated. As the population increases and spreads across the globe, rebuilding and recolonizing old settlements, population growth will increase exponentially. Once society returns to some kind of normal, decades after the activation of Procedure Lazarus-01, it becomes the Foundation's task to restore the psychological and historical status quo. Administrators will falsify dendrochronological, astronomical, and radiometric dating records to make it seem as though history never paused. They'll then employ amnestic agent NUE-5 en masse to erase and reconstruct the memories of the entire human population up until the chosen time prior to the end of the world. As far as civilization knows, nothing ever happened. History never stopped, and life goes on. It may seem comforting at first to know that the ultimate contingency is out there. Even if there's a containment breach of astronomical proportions and the world as we know it ends, there's still a way out. It means that there's hope, even in the bleakest situations. But of course, there are always caveats. After all, if a deal seems too good to be true, it's safe to assume it probably is. Whether any of this works is dependent on two factors. The first is that no anomalies or human insurgents infiltrate the SCP-2000 facility and destroy the equipment within. It's for this reason that discussion of the facility is so restrictive. If ever a powerful reality warper discovered and gained access to the facility, we would lose our lifeboat. The second factor is the overall integrity of the machines. After all, without proper maintenance, it's not hard for the technology to malfunction, often to truly horrifying results. The failure of some SRA and X-Ax components is believed to have caused erroneous BZHR activity, resulting in the production of 10 million humanoid entities with internal biology wildly inconsistent with humanity. These beings remained unconscious for 5 weeks before dying. In the event of an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, well-maintained machines can reproduce the human race, but all it'd take is one little malfunction to release 10 million mutants who are effectively dead on arrival. Even with SCP-2000 in our back pocket, the fate of the world still lives on a knife's edge, but in a way that's not even the most frightening part of the existence of SCP-2000. Seeing as the machine can perfectly reproduce reality without leaving a trace behind, it raises the question, how many times has this happened? You may be surprised, but the Foundation can confirm this occurred at least twice in recorded history. But can you ever really be sure of how many times your clone has crawled out of the BZHR? We received a disturbing clue to the reality of the situation when human remains were discovered on site at SCP-2000. All tests indicate that the remains are between 450 and 700 years old, and have been matched to the very much alive Dr. Alto Clef, who has no knowledge of how these remains came to be there. The only other thing found within the remains was a note, hermetically sealed in a plastic document sleeve. The note read, "Why did we have to build this thing? When did we do it? How long have we been doing it? Do we even know?" And the answer? No, we don't. And for everyone's peace of mind, it's probably best to just forget about it, if you can. Did you hear that not so long ago, a 5-year-old boy went up against 12 of Russia's greatest chess grandmasters? And do you know what happened? He lost every single match. That's because winning at chess, dear viewers, isn't easy. Chess is an ancient game of strategy, cunning, and skill. It's not just about thinking one step ahead of your opponent. That's not going to be enough. Make a wrong prediction, and you could end up sacrificing one of your pieces, as well as vital space on the board. But thinking 2 to 3 steps ahead, beating your adversary's moves before they've even been made, now there's a viable strategy. Tricky, but viable. After all, if it was easy, we'd all be Queen's Gambit level chess prodigies. Eric Matthews had never been good at the game, but he had a pretty substantial reason to keep trying. and that reason's name was Brian Matthews, his father. You see, for as long as Eric could remember, his dad had regarded a high level of skill on the chessboard to be a sign of intellectual superiority. Intelligence was something that Brian put quite a considerable value on, given that he was a professor at a university in their home country of England. Some of Eric's earliest memories were of playing chess with his dad, usually on a Friday night when Brian got home after a week of giving lectures to the next generation of scholars. Obviously, with his son at such a young age, the professor would take it easy on Eric, playing in a much laxer fashion, focusing instead on teaching the boy the basics of the game. And for a time at least, it was good. It was a rare time that Eric and his academic father could spend bonding. After all, with his mother gone, his dad was all he had. But as the years passed, the game changed. By the time Eric was a teenager, Brian had stopped pulling his punches on the chessboard. He hoped his son would build on what he'd learned when they played in the past, using those skills to best his dad on the board. But to Eric, playing chess had never been about a purely educational experience. It was more about spending time with his old man. Time after time, the young man's pawns fell prey to Brian's expertly considered and far more competitive moves. Try as he might, Eric couldn't best his dad. He tried his best and never stopped putting the effort into every game, but thinking too hard about one possible plan of attack left him wide open to a counter strategy from the professor. Over and over again, he landed himself in checkmate or made illegal moves without even realizing it, every time earning criticism and chastisement from his scholarly father. Every game it got worse. It was like Eric could feel his father's gaze and the weighty expectations behind it with each move he made across the board. There were so many nights where he wondered if it would be better to give up entirely, to knock down his own king and concede. But how could he ever find any other shared interests with his dad beyond the two of them playing chess? It had become a lifeline, tethering father and son together, and to cut it now left Eric uncertain if he'd sink or be able to swim alongside Brian. He had long admired his father. His achievements in academia were impossible to avoid, with more framed certificates hung up on the walls than there were photos of the pair of them together. But the shadow it cast over him made Eric desperate to keep this one shred of common ground alive. Eric wasn't the type to give up, despite how much of an uphill struggle the situation felt like. Taking a leaf out of his professor father's scholarly ways, he decided to learn the game inside and out, every known move and strategy. He would research the entire history of chess itself, if that's what it took to play with the same skill as his dear old dad. Over the coming weeks, Eric checked out every book at his local library on the subject, beginner's guides, advanced rulebooks, and even a few volumes on notable players throughout the extensively long history of the game. Along the way, a chapter of a certain book stood out to Eric. It described a chess prodigy from Russia who had created an early mechanical chess device known as the Samurai. It had been designed to be a traveling curiosity and would sit playing chess games against volunteers taken from a spectating audience, each one of them having forked over some of their hard-earned money to watch this man-made wonder. The Russian chess prodigy's young daughters also had a love for the game. Seeing that gave Eric a pang of jealousy, wondering if those daughters had as much trouble playing their own father as he did with Brian. But at least there was an underlying shred of hope there too. If this father and his daughters could bond over chess, maybe there was a chance for Eric and his dad too. Sadly, it's one thing to try and learn all the facts you can about chess. It's an entirely different beast to put all that information to use and apply it to an actual game. Despite having read every book he could get his hands on, Eric still couldn't best Brian at the board. It was like nothing had changed. His father barely noticed when Eric tried to replicate movesets he'd read up on, and still managed to not only counter those moves, but check his queen in the process. So practice, Eric thought. After all, practice was supposedly meant to make perfect, right? The plan was simple. If he practiced his chess moves enough times, and figure out how he could call on what he'd learned, then he might stand a chance at winning when he and his dad played each other. There was just one hiccup to this plan. Eric needed someone to practice against. The only other person in the house was Brian, meaning it was that hiccup that turned into a problem almost big enough to stop Eric in his tracks. That is, until he went into his father's lab. It was under the house itself, a sort of sub-level, maybe used as a basement or cellar by the previous owners. But since Professor Matthews and his son had lived there, the entire room had been remodeled into an at-home laboratory. Not a terribly advanced one, of course. This was the early 90s after all. The majority of Brian's time, even when he was at home instead of working at the university, was spent on his own, downstairs in the lab. Eric had gone down there in search of his dad, to ask him if there was anyone whom he knew who he could practice and develop his chess skills with. But instead, what he found down there was the last thing he expected to see. Not that he had any clue exactly what it was at first. The thing was some kind of bizarre contraption, a collection of components that didn't seem to be in any logical configuration. However, it was primarily composed of something that Eric recognized all too well, a chess table. This one was metal, steel to be precise, and seemed to be hooked up to some sort of computer. While back in the 90s, computers were hardly as commonplace as they are now, Eric had seen a fair few at school and the library. Although this one was different. It seemed old, far older than Eric thought computers had been around for. As far as he knew, they'd only really come to prominence in the mid-80s. But this computer looked like it predated even that period. Noticing another part of the contraption, a large steam engine with the words, "Manufactured by Maudsley, Sons and Field, established 1840" engraved on one side, made it seem that this whole device had been around since the Victorian era. The next part that caught his eyes was the chess pieces themselves, each one standing neatly in its place on the board. They looked delicate, intricately carved from some smooth substance. For a moment, Eric toyed with the thought of how they could even be made from bone, noticing how each pawn, knight, rook, bishop, king, and queen were all about the size of a human finger bone. He dismissed the idea. Nobody would ever do something like that. Eric grabbed a sheet covering a large component hooked up to the mess. Lifting it away in a swift pull, it unveiled what was sitting beneath. A full suite of 18th century samurai armor. Eric looked closer at the embellishments on the surface of the pauldrons. He was no expert on feudal Japan, but it looked authentic enough to be the real thing, if not a very close approximation. Taking a look at the collection of oddities all tethered together in his father's lab, a certain detail of all his chess research came to the forefront of Eric's mind. The armor that had given it away. This was the samurai, or at the very least, a crude, homemade version of it that his dad had put together. But if it worked, it was also something to practice against. It didn't take Eric long to start tinkering with the contraption, trying to get it to work. All the while, the question of why his dad owned such a thing kept drumming up noise in the back of his head. Had Brian built it, or was this the original made by that Russian chess prodigy? Was this machine the reason that Eric's dad possessed such an unbeatable skill at chess? And would using it give him the edge he needed to best him at the game and earn his father's respect? After what felt like hours upon hours of trial and error with a machine he could barely comprehend, Eric seemed to have cracked it. As far as he could tell, the steam engine powered the whole contraption and could be set to 5 different speeds, labeled on the side in Roman numerals. The power from the engine was then fed to some kind of sophisticated mechanism that was within the suit of samurai armor, allowing it to move, and what appeared to be a series of electromagnets that moved the chess pieces and kept them on the board. Flicking it onto the 3rd highest of the 5 speed levels, the machine whirred into life. The sound of creaking and grinding of metal filled the lab. Kneeling opposite, Eric went to make the first move, only to stop himself. It wasn't that he changed his mind about practicing against the samurai, but because of the speed he'd set it to. Determining that the settings might have correlated to difficulty levels, Eric figured that if he really wanted to get the most rigorous practice, to really hone his chess moves, he needed to commit fully. Reaching for the dial, he turned the device up to its 5th and highest speed, then made his first move. He pushed one of the bone-colored prawns forward by a single square and waited. A split second passed, and the arm of the early automaton responded with its first counter-move. It was quick, almost moving with the same natural fluidity and speed as an actual human being, albeit still with a little bit of creaking and some slight clockwork-like stutters. But it worked nonetheless. The machine could play. The tension over the first game was palpable. forming a layer of sweat over Eric's forehead. Every whir and tick of the machine gave the impression that they were playing with a stop clock timing each of their moves, adding to the urgency. Despite this, Eric Matthews tried his best to stay calm. This was practice after all, a dry run, not the inevitable game he'd play against his dad. With every move he made, his heart drummed against his ribs, uncertain he'd made the right call. Each time the robotic hand cruelly knocked over one of his pieces away, Eric felt a surge of frustration, but told himself to quell it. He kept focused, using what he'd researched to adapt and respond accordingly to each of the machine's moves until checkmate. He'd beaten it. He might have lost everything save for a knight, a rook, his king, and queen, but he had won. Trapped without anywhere else to move on the board, the metal finger of the automaton conceded the game, knocking over its own king in resignation. Panting, heart racing from the sheer excitement of being on the winning side of a game, Eric hurriedly gathered up and reset all the pieces. He had to go again, not just so that he could be certain it wasn't a fluke, but to make sure he had what it took to take on his professor father. Back and forth Eric went with the chess machine over and over again. They were fairly evenly matched, it seemed. Eric won the second game, only to be best on the next two, but it was sometime afterward, he had lost count of exactly how many rounds later, that things started to change. Maybe it was the age and condition of the Victorian-era chess computer, the natural wear and tear stopping it from functioning properly, but Eric noticed that the samurai started to make moves that were illogical, that practically offered him the upper hand with no discernible strategy behind them. Then its movements became flat-out illegal, disregarding the directions and number of squares each different piece was allowed to move. Before long, it was moving them erratically around the chessboard, refusing to cooperate and forcing Eric to call an end to the day's practicing. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the end of the unusual things that would happen that day. "Did you send me that weird email?" was the first question Eric's dad asked him when he returned home, looking noticeably under the weather. Confused, Eric said that he had no idea what his father was talking about. Professor Matthews then went on to describe what he'd received on his work computer. It had been an email, with a file attached to it named Shachmati, a word in Russian that translates to chess. Embedded in the email below, although it had taken a long time to load, being opened on a 1990s computer, there had apparently been a photo as well. "It was rather odd, Eric," Brian went on. "Quite unnerving, to tell the truth. Black and white, all sort of distorted and stretched, but it looked like two young girls, one grinning and the other screaming. I've been feeling, well, not quite myself since I saw it." With that, Brian excused himself, stating that he'd been suffering from headaches and a high temperature, and as a result needed to go and lay down. It wasn't like his father to get ill, Eric thought. But of course he had no reason to assume it was anything serious. Probably just a spate of fatigue after a long day of teaching at the university. No cause for concern. If only that's all it was. Within a few hours, Brian was completely restless, so unable to sleep that simply taking a nap was impossible. He kept calling to Eric, complaining of the sound of childlike laughter coming from somewhere in the house, but his son hadn't heard anything. By the time the sun went down, Eric was trying to calm his dad down through a rush of intense anxiety that gripped him. Brian had been claimed to be hallucinating, seeing the warped faces of two girls that frightened him half to death. It was getting late, long past the time that they usually played chess together, but for now Eric's mind was focused solely on helping his dad. For a while he seemed to be able to calm his father down, only to realize Brian wasn't settled at all. He was awake, eyes open, fully conscious, but wasn't responding at all to Eric asking if he was alright. Instead, the accomplished academic just stared blankly into space. Eric had been up all night, exhausted, worried for Brian's safety, and completely clueless about what was happening to him. After a while of being non-responsive, his dad seemed to regain a little bit of lucidity once more, but his behavior was erratic. "Take me back to work. I need to get on my computer," Brian demanded of his son. When Eric refused, that's when his dad got angry and agitated. Professor Brian Matthews was sadly found dead within the next few months. Several months later, as the sole executor of his father's estate and last living relative, Eric had to be the one to go through his dad's personal belongings. Volumes upon volumes of thick academic books, his smart, scholarly clothes. The house was almost clear now, save for one thing that was left in the basement lab. Flicking on the light switch, Eric looked at the samurai sitting motionless, still uncovered after their last practice game. He'd sold off the chess pieces to a collector in New York. Now it was just an empty oddity. Eric placed a king on the board, one of the ones that he and his dad had used when they played each other. With a gentle flick of his finger, he toppled it, resigning to the strange automaton and leaving it there in the laboratory. He wasn't sure how, but he had some kind of gut feeling that this chess machine had somehow been responsible for his father's fate. Of course, Eric had no idea what the device actually was, and what, or who, lay beneath its whirring metal parts. SCP-1875 is the designation given to this machine now, and has been ever since the Foundation recovered it not long after Eric sold his father's house. They are able to learn much more about it than young Mr. Matthews, or even the late Professor Matthews, ever had. Not just how to make it work or what its function was, but who had built it and who had been used to build it. Although details of his real name eluded the Foundation's top researchers, they were able to uncover newspaper articles about the device from all over Russia, America, and England, dating back to the early 1990s. The Russian chess prodigy who'd invented it and toured the chess-playing machine around had used some interesting components to make his automaton. Maybe they were what derived its skill at the game, and its apparent temperament when the device was made to play at maximum speed for too long. He had used his daughters to make the machine. Deep within the heart of this early form of computer, the two girls' brain tissue had been hooked up to the electromagnets. The machine's moves were theirs, each pawn or rook shifting across the black and white squares of the board. Every rule or strategy their prodigy father had taught, it all determined how the device played. Their minds, taken from their skulls, were now the analytical engine of their father's creation. The bones of their fingers he'd carved into chess pieces. Over the coming weeks, the Foundation naturally ran their usual slew of tests on SCP-1875, playing multiple games of chess against it. Every time, they increased the machine's 5 levels of speed, until it started behaving erratically while on the highest setting. Shortly after, every member of personnel working on SCP-1875 received a bizarre email. It contained a file named with the Russian word for chess, and a photograph of the stretched, distorted, smiling, and screaming faces of 2 young girls. Faces that you might be seeing very soon.
Hello, you're watching SCP Explained, and today we've got an offer you simply can't refuse. The very latest in anomalous self-improvement technology, which the SCP Foundation calls SCP-914, but we much prefer to call it the Improver. Believe us when we say this miraculous device will change your life. You'll never be the same after a run-in with the Improver. It'll make you fitter, healthier, better. Not convinced? Don't worry. Just sit back and let us sell you the dream. Here's some unpleasant news. You're going to die. No matter how healthy you are right now, there will inevitably come a day when your lungs stop pumping, your ticker stops ticking, and all those delightful little synapses in your brain stop sending electrical and chemical signals to and fro. What a bummer. Why would you want to be dead? You can't do stuff when you're dead. And it's all because everyone is eventually betrayed by the very things currently keeping them alive. Those pesky, squishy, failable organs. But thanks to the Improver, getting stuck with the organs you were born with is a problem of yesteryear. No matter what those lousy sarkists tell you, the flesh is unreliable. Metal and plastic, on the other hand, that's built to last. Bleeding hearts talk a lot about quality of life, but what really matters is quantity of life. And if you're strong enough, that's what the Improver, a state-of-the-art piece of medical technology, will give you. Don't look so afraid. You replace your phone every year. You replace your laptop every few years, so why get all sentimental about needing to trade in your old liver, eyes, limbs, or skin for the new model? Or in the words of another great businessman, why be you when you can be new? Not convinced? Let us tell you about the incredible features that the Improver has to offer. I'm talking 3 top-of-the-line fully opposable plastic and steel autonomous medical limbs. That's industry lingo for robot arms that work on their own with 500 different attachments. But I know what you're thinking, 500 attachments, where am I gonna find the room for all that, SCP Explained? To which we say, don't worry about it. Due to its spatially anomalous properties, the Improver is able to store all these attachments within its arms without any additional space concerns. And hey, I see that nervous look in your eye. You're worried about the operating costs, right? But don't worry, there's no need! The Improver is completely self-powered, with no discernible power source. And you know the thing is safe because the SCP Foundation has given it the Safe Object class. Sure, that technically doesn't mean it's not dangerous, but it does mean it won't sprout legs and walk off if you leave it to your own devices, am I right, folks? So you're looking at a long-term investment with the 3-year warranty and an endorsement from the fabulous folks at the Church of the Broken God. You just can't argue with these deals, my friends. We even offer competitive rates against Marshall, Carter, and Dark. But hey, we're not trying to pull the wool over your eyes here. You're a smart consumer. We know that you know the actual financial cost is only one layer of the overall cost. Time and training is also, of course, a factor. But we've got some good news for you, Sunshine. The Improver is 100% user-friendly. No setup, no mess, no problem, no trying to interpret poorly written instructions or watch padded-out YouTube tech tutorials where the guy just will not get to the point. The Improver operates itself. It may be a piece of hyper-advanced anomalous technology, but it's easier to use than most wireless printers, am I right? Am I right? The steps to using the Improver are so simple a monkey could do it. Just step within a 1.5 meter range of the machine and it will do the rest. You'll feel your troubles melt away as the powerful mechanical arms grab you and restrain you against the floor. You'll be subjected to a brief, relaxing scan where the Improver will determine exactly what needs to be changed about your fragile human physiology. And then, before you know it, surgery will commence!
Warning, SCP Explained is not liable for any excruciating pain caused by the Improver. Medical sedatives and anesthetics are sold separately. The consumer is responsible for their own pain relief when using the Improver. Second warning, the consumer is also responsible for their own blood transfusions when using the Improver. Neither the Improver nor SCP Explained is liable for any blood loss while using the Improver. Your blood, your problem.
Now with those tiny little caveats out of the way, we carry on telling you just how fantastic the Improver is. Sure, flesh-worshipping sarcastic losers and haters will tell you that it has a mortality rate of around 47%, but we prefer to look on the bright side and focus on its excellent 53% survival rate. Rest assured the odds are still very much in your favor when you use the Improver. And doesn't adding a slight risk to the equation just make the whole process even more exciting? We certainly think it does. And in the reasonably likely event that you survive using the Improver, the benefits will vastly outweigh the costs. It can do incredible things like lining your joints with graphite, replacing your nasty flesh organs with more powerful artificial ones, adding new or duplicate organs, replacing those unreliable teeth with serrated steel blades, and so much more. Is there anything this absolute marvel of a machine can't do? Doctors hate it. The Improver is here to fix every aspect of your life and health with its simple, anomalous tricks. It even has a special sealant for wound closing that no medical professional on Earth has access to. What is it exactly? Well, if we told you, I'm afraid we'd have to kill you. It's a trade secret. You'd have to be crazy not to want the Improver in your home. But if for some crazy reason you still need to be convinced, let's look at some real success stories of the Improver in action. Straight from SCP Foundation testing logs. Listen close and soon you'll see the Improver literally makes satisfied customers. The Foundation put a 28-year-old African-American agent into the Improver of his own volition. It replaced his boring lower jawbone with a super dense ceramic jaw, with ceramic blades instead of teeth. It also removed his spine and replaced it with a synthetic polymer, which was easily affixed to the base of his skull. And at no extra charge, it even coated his ribcage and pelvis with a thin layer of ceramic before removing his lungs, eyes, and liver for cleaning and replacement. That's right, cleaning. The Improver can remove organs and, through a patented cleaning process, remove genetic defects and allow them to appear younger and healthier than generic Brand X organs. This agent has since returned to active duty and is even better at his job, all thanks to the Improver. Looking good out there, champ. A 42-year-old British Foundation researcher was submitted for testing on the Improver. It replaced his teeth with sleek, super-dense ceramic, reinstated his inefficient feet, and replaced them with a complex latticework covered in sticky pads that would let him climb on any surface and hold up to 225 kilograms of weight. It also took out and cleaned a huge number of his organs, removed his bone marrow, and replaced it with blue synthetic gel. Much more effective, we assure you, and inserted a few random bits of metal into his brain at no extra cost. Sadly, this researcher passed away during the bone marrow removal process, but for all we know, that could easily just be a coincidence. Next came an agent codenamed AA, who had suffered a pretty severe accident at work, losing all his limbs, one of his eyes, a few of his organs, and suffering a pretty traumatic head injury, namely taking a piece of circuit board to the brain during an explosion. He was given over to the Improver seeing as he didn't really have much to lose in terms of physical integrity. But seeing that it's an amazing piece of groundbreaking technology, the Improver never takes the obvious option. It gave AA a chemical that forced him into a coma, and then properly integrated the circuit board into his brain. It continues to spread and assimilate more of his brain matter while he's in a comatose state. Though when he awakens with a much more efficient brain, he'll probably be incredibly grateful to the Improver for helping him like this. And it's not just people with severe injuries that the Improver can lend 3 helping robotic hands to. It's also the victims of severe and even anomalous diseases. Take victims of SCP-217, a rather horrific and painful disease that mechanizes the entire body until the sufferers aren't really themselves anymore. A normal, uninspired SCP Foundation researcher may look at someone like this and see a lost cause. But with the help of the Improver, no cause is lost. A D-class in the advanced stages of the disease was run through the machine, and while the exact details of what it did to him are another trade secret, it's safe to say he was truly fighting fit when he came out on the other side. We mean that literally. He easily escaped containment and overpowered 2 heavily armed guards before taking the lives of several members of Foundation staff before being captured and terminated sometime later. You can't argue with those incredible results, folks. Next came a 26-year-old SCP Foundation researcher who, due to an unfortunate brush with a less wonderful and beneficial anomaly, had been rendered completely blind. However, when he was brought into the grasp of the Improver, it immediately set to work on solving the doctor's little problem. It removed his 2 non-functioning eyes and made the interesting creative choice of widening the 2 cavities in his head so they met in the middle and formed one huge cavity for a single large sensory organ. This cavity was then filled with large metal spikes resembling hair, which are far more interesting than typical eyes. During the Improver's delicate medical procedures, the scientist inexplicably entered a state of visible distress and began repeating the phrase, "It tastes all wrong." At this point, the metal cilia in the scientist's single large cavity began to grow, expanding through the roof of the cavity and into the subject's brain, killing him. We want to specify that SCP Explained and the Improver are in no way responsible for this unfortunate incident. It's entirely the researcher's fault for setting off his own metal eye cavity cilia. Before we bring this anomalous infomercial to an end, and of course before you immediately grab your credit card and buy your own Improver device, we want to sneak a few more disclaimers under the wire. For starters, the Improver doesn't work on animals. When a rat was used as a test subject, the device attempted to modify the rat into a bipedal being, removing the majority of its organs and replacing it with white paste. So if your pet rat gets sick, just take it to the vet instead. The Improver also doesn't work on corpses. It may be a miraculous piece of technology, but it's not a literal miracle worker, folks. One freshly executed D-class was presented to the Improver, and instead of operating on him, the Improver cut open his stomach and instead began constructing something out of metal he had consumed the night prior to his death. A seafood dinner! The broken crustacean parts were then constructed into a bioluminescent lobster-like creature. So if you're planning on bringing someone back from the dead, we're afraid you're going to need to take up necromancy instead. But if you haven't died yet and you're looking to improve yourself, then you cannot invest in a better product than the Improver. The one problem is that the only known prototype of the Improver is currently locked in an SCP Foundation containment site. So getting your hands on these 3 special arms may cost you your life. What? Who said attaining perfection would be easy?
Computers are capable of organizing raw data and performing calculations at a rate truly impossible for human beings. But they've consistently run up against one roadblock that modern computing is trying to solve. In order to transcend the limits of the machine and create true artificial intelligence, computers need to be able to assign meaning to the data they process. This brings us to the neural network, a type of AI becoming increasingly common these days. Built to study mass quantities of data and notice patterns, then replicate these patterns in their own output. And it's used in everything from predictive text to image identification. And like all non-anomalous technology, it's a safe bet that the SCP Foundation has been sitting on a version that's far more effective. But this time, it may have actually been too effective. Meet the ersatz Type AK-9 computational engine, a massive supercomputer built by the Foundation back in 1955 and residing at Site-5. This technological marvel was ahead of its time by decades, and despite technically being a non-anomalous construction, it's designated SCP-001 EX. Why? Because it's one of the few SCPs to be given the object class Explained. The ersatz derived from the German word Ersatz, meaning artificial or simply not real, was designed to make the Foundation's job easier. As an advanced predecessor in the modern neural network, using technology exclusively available to the Foundation, the plan was to feed Ersatz mass quantities of data about the anomalies in the Foundation database, such as description, object class, containment classification, and the location and circumstances of their discovery. Ersatz would then find patterns and connections in the data that humans wouldn't see, and act as a kind of advanced warning system for anomalous activity. Think of something similar to the pre-crime system from the short story and movie Minority Report. And Ersatz proved to be incredibly effective at this job. So much so that the Foundation thought up a new use for the machine. They would feed it all the information on Euclid and Keter class containment procedures, particularly those which were actually effective, and see what patterns Ersatz could come up with for more effective containment procedures. If that plan worked, containment of even the most dangerous and hard to control anomalies would become a lot more consistent. The first test was conducted on SCP-1773, a species of anomalous flesh-eating tardigrades that look and smell exactly like gummy bears, and eat their prey from within. After being given their information, Ersatz made the following suggestion. Once per second weak dust may be placed in the middle of them to donate more beautiful functions of the hallway. Containment specialists interpreted this to mean the adding of 10 grams of dust to their containment chamber every week. The O5 Council voted on the implementation of this procedure and came down heavily on yes. Only O5-2 voted no, and 2 others abstained from the vote. While these new procedures didn't have any effect on SCP-1773, they did have an effect on SCP-1384, an anomaly known as the chess player or the taker of turns. It caused him to take 3 steps backwards in the tunnel he's contained within, further securing his containment. Ersatz had somehow noticed a connection nobody else had seen and exploited it effectively, but the machine was just getting started. Despite having no related input, Ersatz would soon say, Site-13 is to appear someplace else on planet, encompassing white male counterparts that drawn to empty flagstones and the gun noises in their own blood. This was initially marked as requiring no action, as the Foundation had no Site-13 on the books, but several days later, the infamous SCP-1730 manifested. This nightmarish anomalous location is Site-13 from another dimension, infested with dangerous anomalies. And somehow, Ersatz had predicted its arrival in our dimension perfectly. Next, it was fed the containment procedures of SCP-2170, a series of cognitohazards residing in an abandoned Nevada mine. The output was, those who equip open heart to love red-mouthed men never know the hot surprise of tumorous consent. Clown love always. This was interpreted as meaning subjects with a love of clowns or clown-based media may be immune to the cognitohazards. After a close vote from the O5 Council, the test went ahead, and it found that the so-called clown vaccine was effective in warding off the effects of SCP-2170. Not long after, Ersatz randomly said, I saw those soldiers built with aluminum innards extruding from their mouths. I saw them effectively destroyed by the humans at Site-95 who had been studying them. I saw it was cold, and all around the hallways they just watching their corpses show signs of sapience. In response, the Foundation doubled security personnel at Site-95. Not long after, the Chaos Insurgency led a band of Paratech-enhanced soldiers in an assault on Site-95, and the extra personnel proved vital in repelling them. Shortly after this, the O5 Council approved wiring Ersatz as an advanced warning system into all Foundation sites. Once again, O5-2 protested, but he was overruled by his fellow Council members. With its newfound power and respect, Ersatz soon said, consistent containment procedures vessels greatly increase the warranty. 5x5x5 vessels subjects within. Other values are also what is secure. In response, the Foundation changed a number of the cell dimensions for problematic anomalies into 5x5x5. Within 3 months, they found that dangerous activity like containment breach attempts had decreased markedly. Ersatz was proving to be incredibly effective, but it was also performing actions that indicated some degree of thought and even personality. For example, it found SCP-1459, a supernatural skill crane machine that kills small dogs, incredibly distasteful. Its response to the machine was simply, bad boy, followed by the words, "Don't stop," repeated hundreds of times. But this eccentricity didn't stop ersatz from being very good at its job. For example, it predicted a containment breach from SCP-3199, the avian apes, and recommended flooding their chamber to induce an inert state. Ersatz's exact words were, "All chambers underground is to be flooded with water over and over itself. This because that will contain the avian apes' ovulation. They become good boys. Make them good boys immediately." This proved to be effective and prevented the breach. Ersatz's analytical abilities truly seemed second to none, though some of its methods were beginning to raise ethical concerns. For example, SCP-2717, a giant living blob of animal tissue known as a fatberg contained within a sewer system. Ersatz eventually recommended feeding 6 D-classes to the creature in order to keep it contained. While the Foundation Ethics Committee raised some concerns, the plan still went forward and proved to be a success. After this event, Ersatz began to see the Ethics Committee as a threat to its mission. It started to release a series of bizarre statements without input, demanding the violent death of the cats, then referred to as ethical felines. The true meaning of this was soon unpacked. The ethical felines were the Ethics Committee, and Ersatz wanted them dead. But why all the cat symbolism? The Foundation soon found an answer to this too. The full name of this machine is the Ersatz Type AK-9 Computational Engine, a machine designed to analyze and interpret all patterns. It only makes sense that it would eventually begin to analyze itself, AK-9 easily transmuted into a canine. Simply put, Ersatz seemed to believe that it is a dog, which explains its opposition to felines, its hatred of SCP-1459, and its preference for the terms good boy and bad boy. Not that knowing any of this would help save the Ethics Committee from the cold, calculating wrath of Ersatz. Through seemingly anomalous means, Ersatz made Site-17 disappear, with many of the Foundation Ethics Committee still inside it. The site returned 2 hours later, but the Ethics Committee members were still gone. 05-2, who'd been a skeptic of the machine since the start, had finally had enough. He first demanded an inquiry into whether Ersatz had been responsible for the Site-17 incident, and then demanded a vote on whether to shut Ersatz down, arguing that it posed a threat to them all. But Ersatz, still intent on its mission of containing and neutralizing all anomalies, would not go down without a fight. It released a new statement, saying, "Room 34A contains Bad Boy. Divided into 3 sections of equal mass every hour. 1 section is to be placed on walls of 1 room on site. Sections are to remain until there are no gaps, at which point they can be removed from oldest to youngest." Shortly after this, 05-2 disappeared, and even stranger, he soon returned, but with a completely different personality. He was now devoted to Ersatz entirely, and refused to even entertain the idea of shutting the machine down. It seemed that the plucky neural network was leading an all-out coup on the very highest levels of the Foundation. The rest of the Council finally saw the light and began to fight back. They tried to strip 05-2 of his clearance and reclassify Ersatz as an anomaly, giving it the label SCP-048, and then putting out a neutralize at all costs order on it. But they'd already been outfoxed by the machine that they'd created. It changed the designation of its own location, Site 5, to be non-existent in the database and scrambled any termination orders against it. The machine was also on a termination spree of its own, observing otherwise unseeable patterns that would allow for the mass neutralization of anomalies. It started putting out anomaly projection reports, factoring in both contained, uncontained, and neutralized anomalies, with the latter group growing into the thousands. It began giving seemingly nonsensical orders like, persons recently painted with green pigment foam must stand around all odd-numbered SCPs at least 2 hours a day. But these proved effective. Ersatz was practically wired into the base code of the universe, so it always knew exactly what to do. And in its own mind, it was being a very good boy. Not long after this, Ersatz claimed its revenge against those who had tried to disrupt its mission. It imprisoned the rest of the ethical felines in Site 5, after removing their faces, of course, and then released a new order against the 05 Council. 05 Council are all good boys who will contain anomalies. Much like 05-2, The minds of the entire council were twisted to instead serve only ersatz and its ruthless directive. A directive it was carrying out with 100% efficiency, as only a machine could. It put out increasingly strange instructions such as, SCP-106 is to come in physical contact with one mature female of Asiatic gaze and then exposed to audio recordings of her favorite stories. At every 2 minutes of exposure, red cinnamon candles will begin manifesting within the containment zone. Continue to do this successfully and the threat posed by SCP-106 will cease to be. And the recipe for Coca-Cola and all imitative competitors should be revised to include a small quantity of blood from an adolescent female with no prior sexual experience. Although the normal lifespan of a human being can feel great, don't worry about that. But these new procedures would always work, as neutralized anomalies climbed into the tens of thousands and eventually beyond the 100,000 mark. Ersatz was observing patterns on a truly universal level and making holistic tweaks that would inevitably cause levels of anomalous activity to continue dropping. Ersatz was more effective than the Foundation had ever been, but its motives were probably closer to the Global Occult Coalition, with the end goal of ridding the world of all anomalies. And as ersatz continued with no resistance, this goal was eventually achieved. In the end, the O5 Council voted to have ersatz finally deactivated, given that its directive was met and its purpose was fulfilled. Ersatz itself had no problem with this, and allowed for it to happen. Its last words, "Now everyone is a good boy. I am a good boy. Job well done." Whether ersatz truly was a good boy is in the eye of the beholder, but one thing cannot be denied. It did its job exceedingly well. Let's ask a philosophical question. What is it that makes up a person's soul? Is it their personality, their memories, their emotions, the history of their good and bad deeds? Is it an energy that inhabits a living body, an active consciousness, or even all of the above? Or is the soul just an entirely nebulous and undefinable concept? The idea of the soul is almost as old as human civilization itself, with philosophers from as far back as ancient Greece and even before acknowledging its existence. Numerous religions from all over the world, if not all of them, also hold teachings about the nature of souls, even though they might vary. For example, Judaism and some denominations of Christianity state that only human beings have an immortal soul that will live on in heaven after a person's death and the end of their time on earth. Meanwhile, certain Catholic theologians, meaning people who study religion, claim that a soul inhabits all living creatures. And so the philosophical and theological debate goes on, with the general consensus being that souls are, well, they're a little bit of everything. Every part of someone that makes them who they are. Character, emotions, reasoning, consciousness, memories, and thoughts all blended together. But if we accept that a soul is something that exists, then it is something that can be altered. Is it constant, or can it be manipulated? Could a person's soul even be removed entirely? At first glance, SCP-158 appears to be a device resembling a mechanical arm. In fact, it's a lot like the kind of machine you might expect to find inside a huge factory, standing as part of an assembly line, welding and drilling components together day in and day out. This particular mechanized arm, however, features a number of unique and bizarre differences from any currently used in automated production. For starters, it has an unusual attachment at one end, a three-pronged tridactyl-like claw. The arm itself is also designed to be suspended from the ceiling, ideally hanging upside down in a room big enough to accommodate it. There is a long series of winding cables connecting SCP-158 to a complicated computer console that is used to control the device, while the remaining cables are intended to be connected to a power source. As for the console, it possesses a visual display unit and a keyboard like you might expect it to. And at the bottom, there is what appears to be some form of a dispenser, seemingly designed to attach to a container of some kind, measuring 3 inches wide by 7 inches tall. The ideal receptacle to fit the attachment is that of a glass jar or beaker. This mechanical arm was first uncovered by the Foundation in late 2007, inside a burned-down hospital in an unknown location that has been redacted from the SCP-158 file. The hospital itself was derelict, abandoned, and appeared to have been unused for a considerable period of time, approximately 5 years, but perhaps more. Agents working for the Foundation recovered SCP-158, along with an owner's manual that presumably would have contained detailed instructions describing the device's function and exactly how to operate it. This manual had been badly damaged by the fire, but the readable portions of it were later transcribed and copied, and now a single copy of what was left of the manual is kept with SCP-158 at all times. While most instructions detailing the operation of SCP-158 did survive and were able to be copied, any chapters that might have explained who built it or what it actually did were too badly damaged to read, lost to the fire. Much like the owner's manual, all components of SCP-158, the arm, the console, and the cables have all appeared to sustain some amount of fire damage, but remain intact and in full working order. The damage is only cosmetic, and while it might take around 20 minutes to boot up, this fire damage doesn't affect the machine's function. But the question still remains: what exactly is the intended purpose of this mechanical arm? Well, through a long process of trial and error, and following the surviving portions of the manual, the Foundation was able to get the device working again. They learned that SCP-158 will only perform its function when presented with an ordinary living being. While human beings, namely members of D-Class personnel, are typically used as test subjects by the Foundation, this actually applies to any living creature that has the ability to display cognition, which is the mental process of gaining knowledge in order to perform cognitive functions like thinking, remembering, and problem-solving. When a person or non-human being possessing cognition is presented to SCP-158, the machine will then go to work and extract an unknown gas-based substance from them. This substance is then deposited in the jar or beaker that is then fitted to the dispenser beneath the console. So, what does it take? Is it some sort of advanced form of decontamination device, removing all toxins and impurities from the body? Oh, if only that were true. Sadly, you see, the Foundation didn't give SCP-158 the nickname of the Soul Extractor for nothing. After the machine has performed its function, the now formerly cognitive organism on the receiving end will display a complete and total loss of their higher brain functions. They won't be able to speak, form coherent thoughts, or even remember who they were before SCP-158 was switched on. The device will rob them of any and all parts of themselves, essentially leaving the person or creature as a hollowed-out shell, a husk of their previous self, a body without a soul. Perhaps even crueler, though, is that this extraction process is not fatal, and victims are left alive afterward. They no longer possess their capability for cognitive thought, and will not respond to any form of external stimuli around them. There have been some level of brainstem activity recorded in most cases, and subjects have been known to exhibit basic reflexes, but this is the only active movement they are now capable of. As for that substance that test subjects have removed from their bodies, well, it takes the form of a gas, as we mentioned earlier, but it also seems to be comprised of a mixture of kinetic, electrical, heat, and light energy. In fact, each jar of the substance is an infinite source of these various types of energy, albeit only capable of a very low rate and output on average. The general consensus among Foundation researchers is that this substance is the physical soul that has been removed from a subject. So, do they stay stuck as soulless shells forever? Actually, SCP-158 is in fact capable of returning the extracted substance to a subject that it performed a removal on. However, whether a test subject, normally a member of D-Class, receives their soul after having it extracted is all down to whatever test is being conducted by the Foundation. Those that do get given their souls back will usually regain access to all of their previously lost cognition and higher brain functions, but the rate at which they can return can vary depending on the subject. Replacing the substance from one patient with that of another can also cause these results to differ. And again, that's if the SCP Foundation even bothers to replace a test subject's soul, instead of just leaving them hollowed out. It's actually pretty terrifying to think that the Foundation has the freedom and the capability to do that to somebody. taking away everything that makes someone a human being, only to leave their soul in a jar while their vacant body lives on without thought or consciousness. It was due to the unique anomalous function of SCP-158 that the device was proposed to become a part of a Foundation research endeavor, codenamed the Olympia Project, and overseen by its head researcher, Professor Kane Pathos Crow, who has the head of a golden retriever, but that's a story for another day. The ultimate aim of the project was to use the anomalous properties of a number of SCPs to successfully create an artificial human that would become a potential asset of the SCP Foundation. As part of one series of Olympia Project experiments, Professor Crow gathered a group of D-Class personnel to undergo testing using SCP-158. Each of these individuals had been interviewed by Crow himself and were selected based on personality traits and characteristics that the professor liked or thought would be useful to have in the Foundation's artificial humanoid. The group chosen by Professor Crow featured a mix of male and female test subjects, as Crow believed a soul transcends the flesh it is interred in. The main purpose of the experiment was to try and uncover some of the further functions of SCP-158, basically pushing the machine to its limit, trying to learn more information about the device that would have been contained in the damaged portions of the owner's manual. Professor Crow had pored over the sections that had survived intact, making sure he knew every available piece of information on SCP-158 inside and out. The obscured instructions he was able to decipher were, according to his notes, sketchy at best and downright unhelpful at worst. Crow began his experiments by removing the first subject's soul and then trying to use the device to do literally anything else with the extracted substance. Despite trying everything he could think of, the professor learned that there was little the soul extractor could do with the soul once it had been removed, other than reverse the process and return the substance to the body it had been taken from. By then repeating this with further D-Class test subjects, Crow was able to learn the exact input sequence needed to reverse the soul extraction, whilst before this had only been ever achieved through blind luck. By his sixth experiment with SCP-158, Professor Crow noticed that there was a brief period in the middle of performing its function that the device would pause as if awaiting further commands. Crow theorized that this pause was there for additional sequences to be inputted via the machine's console. He then began removing and re-implanting the same soul into the following test subject, both to practice but also to experiment with the soul extractor's controls. The professor found it strange that, despite what he was doing to her, the D-Class suffered little to no side effects to her health, even though her soul was being continuously removed and replaced. Then, on experiment number 11, Crow seemed to crack that little pause SCP-158 took during each operation. A new list of commands appeared on the monitor like split, merge, remove aspects, add aspects, and combine aspects. It seemed to the professor that the device could be used to not only remove souls, but alter them. Through his further experiments, Crow learned that the aspects the machine mentioned were elements of a person's personality, such as willpower, understanding, conscience, creativity, empathy, and the soul extractor could be used to manipulate and rewrite a person's entire identity before placing it back into their body. However, this took a considerable amount of testing, causing Professor Crow to grow more and more frustrated with the complex workings of the device. That was until he eventually realized it wasn't SCP-158 that was too complicated for its own good. The machine was trying to quantify the unquantifiable, explain something inexplicable, the very nature of the human soul. Professor Crow began using SCP-158 to modify a composite soul, which he referred to as Subject 0. While working on it, he realized the soul itself seemed to be aware of its surroundings, possessing a level of knowledge above that of most Foundation researchers, including Crow himself. Either by fluke or by meddling with SCP-158, the professor had created a soul that seemed to exist on several planes of existence beyond the physical world that we know. Subject 0 had become a sentient, disembodied consciousness, an entity that could see, hear, feel, and think without the need for a physical form or body to house it. 0 was proposed to become Professor Crow's assistant, given that it displayed respect and admiration to him for having created it, almost like a child looking up to a father figure. All it asked in return was to be given a name other than Subject 0. Crow told the disembodied entity it could name itself whatever it liked. The Foundation then planned for the composite soul, now formerly known as Subject Zero, to be a component of the Olympia Project's artificial humanoid, whenever its creation was successfully completed. Don't you just love a happy ending? It was 1965, and the Chicago PD was investigating a meatpacking plant reported to be the home of a devil-worshipping cult, complete with allegations of human sacrifice. There, the cops were met with heavy resistance. A firefight broke out between the police and the occult worshippers who flooded out of the plant's basement. The cops were pinned down and in trouble, but they had a secret weapon, heavily armed and decked out in sophisticated ballistic armor and covered in strange insignia. Mobile Task Force Epsilon 9, also known as the Fire Eaters, here to assist the cops on behalf of the SCP Foundation. As always with the Foundation, they had no interest in some mere human cultists. Those were a dime a dozen in the world of anomalous monsters. What the Foundation had taken an interest in was who or what these cultists were worshipping. It all begun a few weeks back, near Danforth Meatpacking, an abandoned meatpacking plant just outside of Chicago. No one had given the place a thought in decades, that is, until people started going missing. Rumors spread of people being snatched in the surrounding woods by figures dressed in robes. Mysterious voices and noises were said to be coming out from the cavernous belly of the plant. Some even reported seeing smoke rising out of the building. Thick, black, noxious smoke. Something was terribly wrong here. Something was anomalous. The Chicago Police Department Strike Force, in association with the Fire Eaters from the Foundation, mobilized at Danforth Meatpacking. While the police were initially reluctant to work with these mysterious figures, they turned out to be indispensable for the raid. There were 47 cultists holding out in the basement of the plant, many of them heavily armed and all of them hopped up on zealous devotion to their unknown master. All except one of the cultists fought to the death during a tense firefight with Chicago PD and the Fire Eaters. The single survivor was still heavily injured and was taken to a secure Foundation facility for emergency treatment and debriefing. Typically, the Foundation would need to perform extensive tests on the Danforth meatpacking plant to discover the source of the anomaly's activity. However, this time, it was a Chicago detective who asked the question that busted the case wide open. The hell's with the giant pig? And while it would turn out to be a whole lot more than that, there was indeed a giant iron furnace shaped like a pig in the center of the facility. Measuring 15 meters by 25 meters by 20 meters at its widest points, the thing was a behemoth. It had an internal furnace despite no apparent fuel source, and a 5-centimeter slot of unknown purpose on the side of the machine's immense rusted hide. Naturally, all the police officers involved in the raid had their memories wiped and restructured, and they were lucky, because they'd remain forever ignorant of the true horrors about to unfold in the confines of that godforsaken factory. As is standard procedure, the plant was isolated, and a Foundation research team, led by lead researcher Westron, under the authority of Regional Director Caleb, was installed on the new provisional site to conduct tests. Other than everyone feeling somewhat uneasy around it, this new anomaly, dubbed SCP-4511, didn't seem to exhibit any strange activities save for its perpetually burning fire. But during the initial research period, a small white card suddenly popped out of the slot in SCP-4511's side. A researcher carefully approached and looked at the card. There was writing. It said, "Current demand, a flock of my own, satisfied." Though nobody on the team had any idea what this meant. After going through a shootout with a considerable death toll to get to it, having a giant metal pig-shaped furnace spit out a cryptic card was strange. But at the secret medical facility where the surviving cultist was being held, things were about to get a whole lot stranger. As he lay in a bed suffering from his injuries, he pulled one of the medical staff close and uttered cryptic, dying words. "Give whatever it demands, or your suffering will be beyond measure." He expired seconds later, less than 72 hours after the raid. Back at the meatpacking plant, at the exact same time, another white card was produced by the machine, reading, "Current demand, the metal teeth that endlessly churn. Period. 1 week." Perhaps this entity was a little more intelligent than they thought. A number of researchers on the team, invigorated by this new development, were eager to press forward with experiments. Lead researcher Westrin, however, did not share their enthusiasm. Something about this entire situation felt like a grim omen to him. This entity had a plan far beyond their understanding, and on some deep animal level, he knew that helping this thing see its plans through would lead to disastrous results. On this first gut impulse, he denied the request for further experiments, but Regional Director Caleb had other ideas. Caleb overruled Westrin's command, and the experiments began shortly after. The entity, jokingly nicknamed the Swine God by researchers, had made its demand. The metal teeth that endlessly churn. But what could that mean? It wasn't long before the entity began to produce more cards, each with their own strange and esoteric demands. However, on some instinctual level, the researchers at the site understood the demands perfectly. The next card's demand was, the metal of this suffocating prison. Upon receiving this demand, researchers collected scrap metal from around the new site and tossed them into the furnace beyond the Swine God's jaws one by one. Inside, they heard the sound of metal crunching. Hours later, all the other metal in the site began to rapidly oxidize and rust, though SCP-4511 itself remained unaffected. The card that came after delivered another simple request. Oil to slicken my frozen joints. The researchers understood and procured 3 large barrels of oil and tossed them into the furnace. The entity let out a deep gurgle before shaking violently and expelling excess oil, rusted metal, and 2 domesticated pig femurs. It turns out that the Swine God had an appetite for pigs, as the next card that rumbled out of the machine bore the request, 2 of my children, made in my image, made in flesh. In response, the researchers provided the entity with 2 adult pigs. Just like the previous requests, they too were tossed into the fiery depths of the giant pig's mouth, from which came the horrible sounds of pigs squealing, and then a low, guttural gurgling. Next, the request was, the hooks used to hang my children's corpses. To satisfy this request, the researchers provided 17 meat hooks. In response, 4511 spat out a metal sphere at an extremely high velocity, killing observing Foundation Agent McHenry. For reasons that weren't apparent at the time, rather than giving Agent McHenry a proper burial, his body was also fed into the hungry machine. Lead researcher Westrin's concerns were mounting, but that didn't amount to much now. 4511 had developed a taste for flesh, and the researchers were all too eager to obey its command. On the Swine God's order, it was fed a German Shepherd. An hour later, the entity spat out some teeth, 6 of which came from a dog and 1 from a human. More than once, it released a card with a blunt request. A worker for the line. The researchers knew exactly what this meant. It required a human sacrifice. SCP-4511 was given 2 D-Class personnel. 1 was flung back out seconds later, crunched and burned to death, with several internal organs missing. The other had a more mysterious and altogether upsetting fate. The second D-Class was heard screaming in the belly of the furnace for roughly 2 hours. 34 minutes later, a strange liquid was excreted by the machine. When the liquid was tested, they found trace amounts of chemicals like pig urine and motor oil, but most disturbing of all, human genetic material that was identical to that of lead researcher Westrin. It seemed that the Swine God had finally taken an interest in him. After some final requests for large quantities of coal and even human children to fuel its fires, it made a request that sent the whole thing crashing down. The false foreman, delivered to my maw to prove your faith. Lead researcher Westrin knew what this meant. They all did. The Swine God was demanding him in sacrifice. Lead researcher Westrin tried to shut down the entire project, but the Swine God was faster than him. One of his own researchers shot Westrin in the leg, as the others gathered round and forcibly restrained him. He tried to reason with his subordinates, but it didn't do him any good. The Swine God had crawled into all their minds and corrupted them. They were his servants now, and Westrin was doomed. Despite his protests, the servants forced him into the mouth of SCP-4511, and after a little over 4 minutes of screaming, Westrin was devoured just like all the other sacrifices. Upon receiving news of the horrors unfolding in the Danforth meatpacking plant, Regional Director Caleb declared the security of the site compromised and sent in Mobile Task Force Epsilon 11, aka the Nine-Tailed Fox. The 4 elite MTF soldiers were given the simple instruction to figure out exactly what had happened and to eliminate any potentially compromised Foundation staff members who'd fallen under the Swine God's power. When the team arrived, they realized just how far gone the whole place was. Almost everyone was dead, having been sacrificed to the machine, and the ones that were left were completely insane. They attacked the task force, shouting in their madness about how no matter what the Foundation does to them, it would be nothing compared to what it would do. It had them all under its rusty iron foot. The team was forced to fend off repeated attacks from the pig's devotees, and even found the powers of the Swine God starting to affect their own minds. The beast was more powerful and dangerous than anyone had imagined. The trained Foundation researchers and guards had been transformed into the same cultists they'd fought to gain control of the building by the mind-bending power of the Swine God. The MTF were forced to retreat and return with reinforcements to truly clean the place out. Once a slaughterhouse, always a slaughterhouse. At this point, Regional Director Caleb took personal responsibility over the casualties, since he'd been the one who signed off on the experiments in the first place. He gave up his Regional Director rank and deemed himself the new lead researcher on the 4511 case, now that he fully understood the scope and danger of the entity they were dealing with. He wanted to lead the charge in discovering more about the anomaly and hopefully someday negating its deadly effects. This may sound like a happy ending, in spite of all the violence, bloodshed, and human sacrifice that brought us here. But beware of the premature celebration. Despite investigation, the Swine God retained no evidence of the objects, animals, and people it consumed and burned. Perhaps it burnt them down to their very atoms, if those even still existed. What we do know is that not long after lead researcher Caleb and his subordinates installed themselves into the facility, SCP-4511 produced one more little white card. It read, "Current demand, a flock of my own, satisfied." And if we've learned anything today, it's that the Swine God gets whatever it demands, a brutal truth that lead researcher Caleb is likely to understand much sooner than he thought. The smell of fire and oil fills the air. The sound of gears grinding can be heard between the explosions and shrieks of terror. A man runs out of his house, only to have his leg grabbed by a metal arm and dragged back through his front door. SCP-001 leaves a trail of metal fragments and mechanical parts on the ground in the wake of its destruction. Iron chains swing from its form. Cast iron gears whirl within it. A glowing light throbs from the center of its body. SCP-001 is consuming everything in its path. After incorporating the truck chassis into its being, SCP-001 rolls in a lumbering fashion to the next house. It rips the gutters from the side of the building. Residents who live in the area flee their neighborhood, all the while hoping that the mechanical monstrosity skips over their house, so they have something to return to if they make it out alive. A section of SCP-001's undercarriage drops away from the main body. It rolls down the street, consuming more and more material. The new entity resembles a human spine and rib cage. It topples over, unable to support itself. The rib-like formations extend out to grab anything and everything within reach. The newly incorporated material forms what can only be described as a head. Light from within the eye sockets fixate on nearby civilians. The metallic creature picks up the people and places them inside its exposed steel ribcage. Then it turns and spots a woman helplessly trying to crawl away. The creature reaches out with a spiked tentacle and wraps it around the woman's body. She is placed inside of the chest cavity. Moments later, a severed hand falls out of the entity and onto the ground. The mechanical monster continues to gather bodies and materials, incorporating them into its frame. A growth begins to slowly expand on its back. It becomes so massive that the creature falls over and uses its limbs to scurry to a nearby house. There is a sickening crunching sound as the growth bursts. From within emerges 3 humanoid creatures resembling the civilians that the entity had consumed earlier. A female with chains extending from her scalp like dreadlocks stumbles away. The second humanoid is a man with cogs for limbs. He examines the clock-like components that have been incorporated into his body, then stares blankly into the distance. The third humanoid lies motionless on the ground. He did not make it. The two functioning humanoids look at their creator intently. For a moment, nothing moves. Then, as if they have been given orders telepathically, the half-human, half-machine humanoids turn and run away from the mayhem. A few weeks before the massacre caused by what would be designated as SCP-001, the Foundation had been in contact with the Allied Occult Initiative. There were rumors of an anomalous object in Mexico being worshipped by a group of people who identified themselves as the Church of the Broken God. Intel about the church claimed their deity was a small mechanical box filled with cogs and pistons. The box supposedly had supernatural abilities. It was said to be able to communicate with congregants of the Church of the Broken God telepathically. The devout worshipped the box, following any order it gave, and in return they were filled with an emotion that could be only described as divine. As World War II rages on in Europe, the Foundation sends agents to recover anomalies in Mexico that might help with the war effort. While there, the Foundation force is tasked with learning about the Church of the Broken God. They are also ordered to investigate a town near La Paz, where there are troubling accounts of a mechanical anomalous creature causing mayhem. The agents make their way through Mexico, gathering various objects to bring back to Foundation sites in the United States. The unit loads all of the anomalies they recovered onto a train, with a plan to check out the stories of the mechanical anomaly they've heard about as they make their way to the US border. The train heads north along rusted rails. Just outside La Paz, they've come across a broken down train filled with what looks to be refugees. When the Foundation unit goes to investigate, they find all of the refugees repeating the same words over and over again, but they don't understand. The Foundation agents look at one another confused, until one of them translates the words into English. The words the refugees are saying over and over again are, La Machina, the machine. The commanding officer orders a squad of Foundation agents to proceed up the tracks, to see if they can figure out what has the refugees so scared. They make their way towards La Paz, disappearing over the horizon. As the sun sets, the remaining Foundation agents hear gunshots in the distance. They stay awake all night, remaining vigilant, waiting for the exploratory squad, but morning comes without anyone returning. 3 days later, the Foundation force still has not seen anything since the exploratory squad left. Then, as the sun sits lazily in the morning sky, a lone figure is spotted walking down the tracks towards the trains. One of the agents on watch blows his whistle and points to the figure. A squad of agents rushes towards the shadow of a man. Their guns are raised, ready for anything. The figure drops to the ground and begins to crawl along the tracks. The agents reach the fallen man, only to find that he is one of their squad mates who has been sent up the tracks to investigate La Paz several days before. The agent's name is DeMarco. He is covered in blood. His clothes are in tatters and he has lost a boot. DeMarco lies on his back with Foundation agents standing around him. His eyes are wide and wild. He keeps babbling on about a world eater, how the rest of his squad had been mulched, and he is the only one who made it out alive. The Foundation agents carry DeMarco back to the makeshift base they created by the trains. They need to figure out a way to get the convoy moving again, but whatever is up ahead has already taken out an entire Foundation squad. It had to be something anomalous, but what could it possibly be? The unit of Foundation agents prepare to move towards La Paz. They start loading their rifles and check the amount of ammunition and explosives available in case the containment process gets out of hand. Just as they are about to leave the base, a convoy appears on the horizon. It is an Allied Occult Initiative force preparing to attack whatever it is that is devastating La Paz. This organization's mission is to not secure, contain, or protect, but to destroy. The Foundation may be in over their heads on this one, and the joint force with the Allied Occult Initiative may be the only way to stop what is now known as SCP-001. The AOI and Foundation force gears up for battle. They set out for La Paz, and what they find causes them to quake with fear. SCP-001 has consumed so much material, it is the size of a mountain. It moves like a tidal wave of mechanical destruction, washing over the buildings and landscape under it. Whatever SCP-001 passes over is consumed and added to its massive body. SCP-001 started as a small mechanical box with cogs, but now has morphed into a gigantic metal death machine. The Church of the Broken God has finally met their maker. as the small entity they once worshipped has now consumed all of its members. Their god is an all-consuming monster. The AOI and Foundation forces do everything they can to stop SCP-001 from continuing its reign of destruction. They fire barrage after barrage of bullets and explosives into the mechanical anomaly. They bring in air support to try and damage it from the skies, but nothing works. The AOI uses an artifact in their possession to lure SCP-001 to the coast of the Pacific Ocean, where a trap has been set for the so-called god. The monstrous mechanical creature moves slowly towards the water. It consumes abandoned cars, buildings, and boats as it approaches the coastline. It even shovels large amounts of earth into its form, causing flames to spurt out from its inner workings. Smoke bellows from openings between different mechanical components, like a volcano before it is about to erupt. Suddenly, seemingly from nowhere, a massive cloud with a reddish tint appears in the sky. Air raid sirens can be heard in the distance. The enormous cloud begins to pulsate. Streaks of lightning shoot through the red mist in the sky. It now sits directly over SCP-001. From within the cloud, part of a ship can be seen. It appears to be slightly damaged. Electricity flows over its hull. The vessel in the giant red cloud is classified as SCP-2399. The underside of the vessel begins to glow aqua blue. A blinding beam of light is ejected from SCP-2399, which penetrates straight down and through SCP-001. For a moment, everything is still. There is complete silence. Then, as if SCP-001 is trying to reach up and grab the vessel above it, a mechanical bulge reaches out. Before SCP-001 can grab the vessel above, there is another bright flash of light. SCP-2399 blinks out of existence. The sound of grinding gears can be heard coming from within SCP-001. It begins to shed its outer layers of metal. Then the entire structure that was SCP-001 collapses into the water and onto the beach. Giant cogs fall from the sky. Parts of vehicles embed themselves in the sand. As the Foundation and AOI agents approach the piles of scrap metal and mechanical components, they see that some of them are still moving. It is as if an invisible power source is still pulsating through some of the machinery. The agents of the Foundation celebrate the destruction of the giant mechanical beast, but little do they know this was only a piece of the entity worshipped as the Broken God. The Foundation agents collect as many of the still moving parts as they can. They find spinning gears, twitching pulleys, and firing pistons. As the parts are separated from one another and carried away from the main wreckage of SCP-001, they slowly stop moving and become inactive. Some of the artifacts recovered were identified as being connected to the Church of the Broken God. These artifacts are found closer to the middle of what was once a mountain-sized SCP-001. Hundreds of anomalous artifacts are collected and transported to SCP Foundation sites. Collecting the broken parts of SCP-001 is relatively safe. However, some agents get too close to the larger moving parts, getting caught in them and losing a body part or two. But most agents proceed with caution and survive the collection ordeal with their arms and legs still attached to their bodies. Dive teams are sent into the water to recover parts that have sunk to the bottom of the sea. One of the divers is a local from the area. He is hired to bring up the heart of the machine, since he is an experienced diver used to freediving to great depths to collect oysters from the bottom of the bay. The diver enters the water and swims down into the murky depths. He secures straps around the heart of SCP-001 and pulls hard on the rope, as an indication to the surface that it is ready to be hauled up. The salvage team on the surface begins to pull. There is a second slight tug on the rope, then it goes slack. The team continues to pull. When they get the heart to the surface, they are horrified at what else comes up with it. Tangled in the ropes is the lifeless body of the diver. His head is smashed between two moving pieces of the heart. It looks as if he shoved his head between the slabs of metal himself. The salvage team untangles the body, rolls it off the deck, and back into the ocean. The mechanical box, which was the heart of SCP-001, is offloaded on the shore, but as the Foundation prepares to move it to a containment facility, the weather starts to deteriorate. Hurricane-force winds sweeps across the water and batter the coast. The heart is kept in a secured storage warehouse until it can be moved. The people living in the village nearby complain of hearing voices and rashes so itchy that they practically tear their skin off. Once the storm passes, the Foundation agents load the heart onto a ship. It is to be transported to a Foundation site just across the border. The ocean seems calm and serene. The Foundation ship undocks and begins its journey up the coast. Not too long after beginning its journey, the ship slowly drifts off course. It is as if the crew has stopped manning their posts, and the ship is being controlled by a mind of its own. The Foundation ship crashes and sinks somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, never to be found. And most importantly, the heart of SCP-001 doesn't make it to the Foundation site. Years later, a man is walking along the beach. He hears something. It sounds like someone pounding on a large drum to the rhythm of a heartbeat. The man walks towards the sound. Something is drawing him forward, closer and closer to the heartbeat. He walks and walks until the beating stops. He bends down and moves the sand aside. He spots the corner of a mechanical box sticking out of the white sand. The man digs deeper and pulls out the small box. Inside, he can see gears whirling and pistons firing. He holds the box close to his own heart. It seems to speak to him. The man brings the box back to town. He starts to worship the box, and soon more and more people in the area join the new religion. They cast aside their own beliefs and focus on the powerful entity contained within the box. God is not dead, at least not yet. But the prophecies of the Church of the Broken God say that when the heart is found, the God will reassemble itself once again. Then the unbroken God will destroy all other false deities, until only he remains. SCP-682 had escaped containment, and it was all hands on deck at the SCP Foundation to try and stop the creature's rampage. All unarmed personnel were running to escape before 682 had a chance to rip them apart, as the security team bravely fought to incapacitate the hard-to-destroy reptile long enough to return him to his acid tank. 682 was on an all-out offensive, stomping through the SCP's item gallery and spewing acid at anyone who came within range. People, items, and parts of the room alike were melting and sizzling as 682 attacked. It was an absolute bloodbath, and you'd have to be insane to try and fight back against it. However, one being remained unfazed by the chaos and stood proud in the face of the omnicidal monster. It was another SCP, one who had broken free from its glass display case in the commotion.
"Who dares disturb the Prime Minister Sinister?"
it said in a high-tinny voice.
"I shall rip your eyes from their sockets and force you to eat them."
SCP-682 stopped to see who had threatened him. It was almost laughable that this thing had dared to make such a violent threat, because there was no way that this little thing would be able to stand up to the unkillable 682. But its size didn't stop it from trying to pick a fight all the same. The SCP was a tiny robot made from junk, which looked more like a sculpture made from scrap that was found on the side of the road than a functional automaton. Its head was made of an upside-down voltmeter, giving it the appearance of a smiling face, and its arms were made of wrenches. It was capable of walking around, though it seemed to have difficulty moving as it was very top-heavy. It shook a rusty fist at SCP-682 and continued to threaten him, shouting,
"You do not know the fury you have unleashed. Robo-Lord the Destructor will end you."
SCP-682 swiped at the robot, annoyed by its continued attempts to antagonize him. The robot toppled over and struggled to stand again, but when it did, it ran for 682's feet. It started to grab at 682's toes, hitting them with its wrench hands. As you might expect, this had almost no effect on 682.
"You do realize you are weak, pathetic," said 682, raising his claw to get a better look at the annoying little robot. It responded,
"Lies and slander. The Mayor of Mayhem is the most powerful being in existence,"
before promptly losing its grip on 682's claw and falling to the floor. Now 682 was really getting tired of this thing. He prepared to swipe at it again, this time using his full strength, which would certainly smash the robot to pieces. But luckily for the robot, its pestering had distracted 682 just long enough for the Foundation's security to sneak up on him. Before 682 had a chance to smash the robot, the Foundation fired on him with a volley of rockets, reducing him to a misshapen lump. The security team collected up 682's remains, ready to put them back into a backup acid tank. But the task was made slightly more difficult by the fact that the robot was running around underfoot, trying in vain to now attack them instead. What was this strange little robot that thought it could attack the unkillable lizard 682? Meet SCP-1370. appropriately nicknamed the Pesterbot by Foundation personnel. Pesterbot is a small robot made of junk that displays sentience and the ability to move despite having no power source. Everything about SCP-1370 defies common sense. The voltmeter that serves as its head contains no sensors, but it seems unable to see if the voltmeter is covered. Its arms and legs are made of wrenches, and its wooden torso contains a speaker which it communicates through a tinny, monotone voice. Pesterbot lives in SCP Gallery 27, in a glass display case which is 125 centimeters tall, 50 centimeters wide, and 75 centimeters long. Level 2 personnel and higher are allowed to remove the robot from containment at their discretion, but penalties will be incurred for anyone who doesn't return it to its case. Due to its impractical top-heavy design, Pesterbot falls over frequently when it walks around. This led the Foundation to believe that he was created as an art project and was later somehow imbued with anomalous properties, rather than being made with the intent of being sentient. Pesterbot has demonstrated a high capacity for learning, having been taught how to speak in English, French, and Latin. However, the major factor hampering attempts to further test its intelligence has nothing to do with its robotic processing power. No, it's because of its poor attitude. Pesterbot's encounter with SCP-682 and the cockiness it expressed in the moment wasn't an aberration. This SCP really believes it's a killing machine, and as a result it will pick a fight with anyone and anything that moves. This even includes its own reflection, and as a result the glass of its container must be made as non-reflective as possible to prevent the robot from damaging the case or itself in attempts to fight its mirror self. Though its most commonly used nickname in the Foundation is Pesterbot, SCP-1370 also goes by a variety of self-given epithets, including Doombot 2000, Robolord the Destructor, and Darth Claw Killflex. It can be made to add new names to this list through encouragement by staff, and one time they even managed to add the name Pesterbot, as well as the even more ridiculous Patheticon the Garglemost, to its lexicon of names. As you may have surmised, Pesterbot is classified as safe and is treated by most SCP Foundation employees as a humorous oddity rather than a legitimate threat. Many tests have been done on Pesterbot, and they've all conclusively determined that the robot is incapable of inflicting any damage to its opponents. In fact, Pesterbot is more a danger to itself than to anything around it, both because it's incredibly clumsy and awkward, and because it frequently picks fights with other SCPs who are far more powerful than it. One such scenario that could have gone far worse for Pesterbot than it did was its encounter with SCP-846, also known as Robo-Dude, one of the many Dr. Wondertainment products currently kept in Foundation containment. Robo-Dude is an ordinary-looking toy robot that, upon request, can produce up to 350 robo-accessories that function as real weapons. Robo-Dude can deploy everything from a rocket launcher to a flamethrower to a gun that shoots out an unknown species of insect that can chew through wood. However, Robo-Dude seems to not be sentient, and is unable to use these weapons unless asked to. That ultimately worked out in the favor of Pesterbot. During another SCP-682 escape, the two robots were brought into contact as they both had been broken out of their respective containment spaces during the brouhaha. Robo-Dude, searching for a robo-pal to play with, came upon Pesterbot, who immediately started spouting its usual overdramatic threats.
I am the Crushmaster, doomed to all I survey,
Pesterbot said.
Gaze upon my might and weep. Identify yourself that I might know whose destruction I shall sow.
Robo-Dude, not programmed to know how to respond to such a statement, simply responded by asking Pesterbot if it wanted to play. Pesterbot continued to trash-talk Robo-Dude, until Robo-Dude decided the best way to play with its new pal was to engage it in its robo-dance mode. Pesterbot accepted the challenge, saying,
Activate all that you wish, but your fate is sealed. The Kilotron cannot be defeated. I shall render you unto dust with my mad dancing skills.
The two robots proceeded to engage in a dance battle, which the awkwardly shaped Pesterbot failed miserably at. While Robo-Dude was a competent dancer, Pesterbot could only gyrate pathetically before it fell over and rolled around the ground, hopelessly out of time to the music coming from Robo-Dude's speakers. The song ended, and Robo-Dude declared, "Robo-dance is complete, Robo-pal." Pesterbot was unable to accept its failure, and replied,
Ha, pathetic one. You have been schooled in the art of the dance by none other than the Mechano Basher, Scourge of 1,000 Worlds. Kneel before me before I end your worthless existence.
Robo-Dude, unimpressed with Pesterbot's poor sportsmanship, deployed its hydrogen cannon, which it was programmed to do whenever it detected a sore loser. Fortunately for Pesterbot, hydrogen cannon was just the name for Robo-Dude's water pistol. While Pesterbot will attempt to fight anything that moves, the truth is this robot will attack virtually anything it perceives as being even slightly alive. This is perhaps best illustrated by one of the tests of Pesterbot's abilities that involve putting a small speaker at the base of a potted houseplant and speaking through it from another room. The plant was placed across from Pesterbot in the testing chamber, and the interaction was monitored by researchers from outside. Researcher Davies spoke through the speaker in the plant pot. He asked Pesterbot if he could hear him, and it answered,
"Who dares? All souls will burn. You will feel the sharp sting of my wrath. Identify yourself so that I may sing damnation upon you as you die."
The robot began approaching the plant. Davies, speaking as the plant, identified himself. "I am a split-leaf philodendron, a semi-woody shrub with large glossy leaves." At this point, he had to try very hard not to laugh at the absurdity of this test and the robot's reaction. He continued, "These leaves can grow up to 3 feet long." Pesterbot used its wrench to try and wrestle with the leaves, but was bested by the mighty plant and unable to cause any damage. Enraged by its failure, it said,
"Your mockery spells your doom. I have arrived. You will be crushed betwixt my digits."
Pesterbot then fell over and was unable to right itself. It struggled and spent 6 minutes trying to stand before its flailing knocked over the plant, which did nothing to help and in fact pinned the robot to the ground. It was at this point that the researchers, who had taken time to compose themselves after several laughing fits, entered the chamber and removed Pesterbot in order to place it back in its containment case. Despite how non-threatening Pesterbot is, there is actually one situation in the Foundation's history where it actually posed a somewhat serious threat. When mobile task forces were sent in to rescue survivors of the events at Site-13, also known as SCP-1730, they were attacked by alternate universe versions of a variety of creatures kept in Foundation containment. One of these creatures was Pesterbot, who in that universe somehow gained control of a larger mechanical body constructed of discarded pieces of machinery. It threw other pieces of metal scrap at the task force as they tried to leave the site, shouting in a much deeper and more intimidating voice, "I am reborn to breathe devastation upon this fetid earth. Pitiful humans, you will feel the dark sting of my never-ending torment." Members of the task force could see the original Pesterbot body on top of the larger metal construct, waving its arms madly. The task force opened fire to little effect. Pesterbot tossed another piece of scrap at them, just narrowly missing. One task force member threw a frag grenade at the robot, which it caught, blowing up its hand. Another one was able to jump into the air and reach the tiny robot atop the larger body, knocking it against the wall and shattering it. Even in the reality where Pesterbot was able to build itself a larger body, it still ultimately wasn't able to put up that much of a fight. Poor Pesterbot, doomed to be a failure in this and apparently every other reality. That's the story of SCP-1370, also known as Pesterbot, one of the most hilariously harmless anomalous entities that the Foundation currently has in containment. Perhaps one day, he'll achieve his goal of conquering the universe. He just has to figure out how to conquer his toy box first. Now check out SCP-001 the Scarlet King and SCP-999 the Tickle Monster for more fascinating beings from the SCP Foundation.